There are places on this earth where the sand itself seems to breathe with memory, where the wind carries whispers of voices silenced so long ago that even their languages have crumbled into dust. The Arabian Peninsula holds such places in abundance, buried beneath dunes that rise and fall like the slow pulse of a sleeping giant, concealing secrets that have waited millennia for someone patient enough, curious enough, to listen. And in the winter of 1991, deep in the most forbidding desert on the planet, a small team of explorers stood at the edge of a discovery that would force the modern world to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the ancient one. The image that brought them there had been captured from space. A NASA satellite, its radar instruments designed to peer through clouds and darkness, had turned its gaze toward the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, that vast ocean of sand stretching across southern Arabia, where summer temperatures routinely exceed 50 degrees Celsius, and where, for centuries, even the hardiest Bedouin had ventured only at the margins. The radar saw what human eyes could not. Beneath the dunes, invisible to any traveller standing on the surface, lay a ghostly web of ancient tracks, caravan routes worn into the bedrock by countless thousands of journeys, all converging on a single dark point roughly 170 kilometres north of the coastal city of Salalah in what is now Oman. The track should not have been there. The empty quarter was supposed to be exactly what its name implied: empty, barren, a place where nothing had ever existed worth remembering. Yet the satellite imagery told a different story. Those faint lines etched into the stone beneath the sand spoke of movement, of commerce, of a world that had once pulsed with life in a landscape now given over entirely to silence and heat. And at their convergence point, where all those ancient roads met like the strands of a spider's web drawn toward its centre, something waited. Filmmaker Nicholas Clapp had spent years chasing this ghost. He had pored over medieval Arab geographies, over the accounts of classical writers who spoke of a fabulously wealthy city somewhere in the southern deserts, over the Quran itself, which described a place of towering pillars destroyed by divine wrath. The city had many names in the old texts: Ubar, Wabar, Iram of the Pillars, but they all pointed toward the same legend: a metropolis of impossible riches built on the frankincense trade, swallowed by the desert as punishment for the arrogance of its people. For most of the 20th century, scholars had dismissed the story as myth, as allegory, as the kind of cautionary tale that cultures invent to warn against hubris. But Clapp believed the legend remembered something real, and when the NASA images landed on his desk, he knew he had found his proof. The expedition that set out in autumn of 1991 included archaeologist Juris Zarins of Southwest Missouri State University and British explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes, a man who had crossed both polar ice caps and who described the empty quarter as the most hostile environment he had ever encountered. They followed the coordinates the satellite had provided, travelling by four-wheel drive as far as the vehicles could manage, then continuing on foot into terrain that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to enter it. The sand shifted constantly beneath their boots, the heat pressed down like a physical weight, and yet the further they travelled, the more certain they became that they were walking in the footsteps of ghosts. The village of Shissa had been there all along, a tiny settlement clustered around a water well that the local Bedouin had used for generations. The well was the only reliable source of water for hundreds of kilometres in any direction, and the villagers knew that ancient people had lived there before them. Pottery shards and worked stones littered the ground, and the old stories spoke of a city that had once stood on that spot before God struck it down. But no one had ever dug beneath the surface. No one had ever asked what lay under the sand and the limestone that formed the floor of the oasis. When the excavation began, the team found artifacts almost immediately. Pottery fragments bearing the distinctive styles of Persia, of Rome, of Greece, evidence that this remote desert outpost had once been connected to trade networks spanning thousands of kilometres. They found the remains of walls, massive walls built from local stone, each roughly 2 feet thick and rising 10 to 12 feet high. And at the corners of the structure they found the stumps of towers that had once stood 30 feet tall, looming over the desert like sentinels guarding something precious within. The towers were the key. The Quran, in its description of the destroyed city of Ad, speaks specifically of Iram, the many-towered city, the city of lofty pillars, the like of which had never been built in the land. For centuries, commentators had debated whether this description referred to a real place or to a metaphorical construction, a symbol of human pride destined for divine destruction. But here, beneath the sand of the empty quarter, the towers were real. They had been built from stone and mortar by human hands nearly 5,000 years ago, and they had stood watch over one of the most important trading centres in the ancient world until the earth itself opened up and swallowed them whole. The mechanism of destruction became clear as the excavation progressed. The fortress of Ubar had been built directly over a massive limestone cavern, a void in the bedrock that had been carved out over millennia by the flow of underground water. The same aquifer that made the site habitable, the same water source that had drawn travellers and traders to this spot for thousands of years, had also been slowly undermining the very foundations of the city. As the population grew, as the demand for water increased, the aquifer was depleted faster than it could replenish itself. The roof of the cavern, weakened by the extraction of the water that had supported it, began to crack and crumble, and sometime around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, it gave way entirely. The collapse must have been catastrophic. The central fortress, with its towers and its walls and its storerooms full of frankincense and myrrh, dropped into the void beneath it. Sand and rubble poured in to fill the space, burying everything: the buildings, the goods, the people who had not escaped in time. The survivors, if there were any, would have fled into the desert with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of what they had lost. And the desert, patient as always, covered over the wound and erased all trace of what had been. For 16 centuries Ubar had waited beneath the dunes. The caravan routes that had once converged on its walls were buried under meters of sand, invisible to anyone walking the surface. The towers that had once been visible for miles across the flat desert plain were reduced to stumps hidden beneath a limestone capstone that the shifting sands had sealed like the lid of a sarcophagus. The city that had been built on frankincense, that had grown rich beyond imagination on the aromatic resin that the ancient world valued as highly as gold, had become a legend, a cautionary tale, a name invoked in scripture as a warning against the pride that goes before a fall. And then a satellite looked down from orbit, and the sand gave up its secret. The discovery of Ubar in 1992 was not merely an archaeological triumph, it was a rupture in the way the modern world understood the ancient one, a crack in the comfortable assumption that the deserts of Arabia had always been empty, that the peninsula had contributed nothing to human civilization before the rise of Islam, that the stories preserved in scripture and legend were fantasies invented to fill the void where real history should have been. The NASA images and the excavation that followed them proved that the void had never been empty at all. It had been full of cities and trade routes and kingdoms and peoples whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the desert wind and the sacred texts that insisted, against all secular skepticism, that the ruins were still there for those willing to look. This is the story of that looking. This is the story of the civilizations that flourished in Arabia for 3,000 years before the Prophet Muhammad was born, civilizations that built cities and dams and temples, that carved tombs into cliff faces and developed writing systems and engineering techniques that would not be matched for centuries, that grew wealthy beyond measure on the trade in incense and spices and pearls, and that vanished so completely that the modern world had to be reminded they had ever existed at all. This is the story of how satellites and scripture, archaeology and ancient legend came together to drag a buried world back into the light. But to understand what was found, we must first understand what was lost. And to understand what was lost, we must listen to the voices that never stopped speaking of it, even when no one believed them anymore. The Quran does not whisper about the destroyed peoples, it thunders. Again and again, across dozens of surahs, the sacred text of Islam returns to the same theme. There were nations before you, nations of great power and wealth, nations that built monuments the likes of which had never been seen, and God destroyed them utterly for their arrogance and their refusal to heed the warnings of his prophets. The ruins of these nations, the Quran insists, are not buried in some distant land beyond the reach of human memory. They are here. They are visible. You pass them on known roads, and if you have eyes to see and hearts to understand, you will recognize them for what they are: monuments to divine justice, warnings written in stone and sand for all who come after. The people of Ad are among the most frequently mentioned of these condemned nations. According to Islamic tradition, they were a powerful tribe who lived in southern Arabia, in a region of fertile valleys and abundant water, and they grew proud of their strength and their accomplishments. God sent to them the prophet Hud, who warned them to turn away from their arrogance and worship the one true God, but they mocked him and refused to listen. And so God sent against them a punishment that the Quran describes in terms of almost unbearable vividness, a screaming, violent wind that lasted 7 nights and 8 days without pause, a wind that tore the people from the ground and left them lying fallen as if they were hollow trunks of palm trees, a wind that erased their civilization so completely that nothing remained but ruins and the memory of divine wrath. The image is haunting precisely because it is so physical, so specific. The Quran does not speak of Ad as a metaphor or an allegory. It speaks of them as a people who lived in a particular place, who built particular structures, who suffered a particular fate that left particular evidence behind. The hollow trunks of palm trees. That phrase has echoed through 14 centuries of Islamic commentary, scholars debating whether it refers to the actual bodies of the dead, preserved somehow by the desiccating wind, or to the architectural remnants of their buildings, standing empty and skeletal against the desert sky. Either way, the Quran insists that the evidence is still there, still visible, still waiting to be read by those who understand its meaning. The people of Thamud received similar treatment. They lived in the Al-Hijr region of northern Arabia, in a landscape of dramatic sandstone cliffs and narrow valleys, and they too were blessed with prosperity and skill. The Quran describes them as carving houses from the mountains, as building dwellings in the rock itself, and archaeological evidence confirms that this is precisely what they did. The tombs and facades of Mada'in Saleh, carved into the rose-red cliffs of the Hejaz, stand as silent testimony to a people who shaped stone with a precision that still astonishes modern visitors. God sent to them the prophet Saleh, who performed miracles to prove his divine mission, but they too refused to believe. And so God destroyed them with Al-Taghiya, the overwhelming blast, the catastrophic sound, the annihilating roar that left their carved dwellings empty and their civilization in ruins. When the Prophet Muhammad was on his way to Tabuk in the year 630 CE, leading his army through the northern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, he passed through the territory where Thamud had once lived. According to Islamic tradition, he directed his followers to look upon the Thamudic monuments that still stood in the landscape, the carved facades and abandoned settlements that dotted the cliffs and valleys of the region. He urged them to learn lessons from what they saw, to understand that the ruins of a people destroyed for their evil doing were not ancient history, but present warning, not distant legend, but immediate moral instruction. The stones themselves were teachers, and the faithful were expected to read their lessons. This is the profound tension that lies at the heart of any attempt to understand pre-Islamic Arabia. The Quran preserves detailed memories of civilizations that secular history had entirely forgotten. It names peoples, describes their accomplishments, locates their ruins in specific geographic regions, and insists that the physical evidence of their existence and their destruction remains visible to anyone who travels the ancient roads. For 14 centuries, these passages were read primarily as theological statements, as lessons about the consequences of disobedience and the inevitability of divine judgment. The destroyed peoples were cautionary tales, moral examples, warnings to the faithful rather than subjects for historical investigation. But what if the Quran was also being literal? What if the ruins it described were not metaphors but actual archaeological sites, waiting to be excavated and studied and understood? What if the scripture that the modern world had learned to read as mythology was in fact preserving accurate geographical and historical information about civilizations that had left no other written record of their existence? This is the question that has driven a generation of archaeologists into the deserts of Arabia, and the answers they have found have been, in many cases, more extraordinary than even the most devoted believer could have imagined. To understand the scale of what was lost, one must first understand the scale of what existed. The Arabian Peninsula between roughly 3000 BCE and 600 CE was not the empty wasteland that later centuries would imagine it to be. It was a crossroads, a fracture zone where competing empires met and traded and fought, where monsoon-fed valleys supported agriculture and permanent settlement, where urban cultures rose and flourished and fell in cycles that left layer upon layer of ruins beneath the sand. The desert that now dominates the landscape was not always so absolute. Climate patterns shifted over millennia, and periods of greater rainfall created oases and river valleys that could support populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The peninsula was never a paradise, but it was far from empty. 3 great economic engines drove Arabian civilization during these millennia, and understanding them is essential to understanding why the cities existed, why they grew wealthy, and why their loss was so catastrophic for human memory. The first and most famous was the frankincense and myrrh trade. The aromatic resins that the ancient world burned in temples and palaces and homes, that were used in medicine and cosmetics and embalming, that were valued quite literally as highly as gold, came almost exclusively from a narrow strip of territory along the southern coast of Arabia and the Horn of Africa. The frankincense trees that produced the precious sap grew only in specific conditions. The monsoon-fed mountains of Dhofar in modern Oman and the Hadramaut Valley of modern Yemen, where the combination of altitude, rainfall and soil chemistry created an environment found nowhere else on Earth. The trees could not be transplanted. The resin could not be synthesized. If you wanted frankincense, you had to get it from Arabia. The trade routes that carried this precious cargo northward became the arteries of Arabian civilization. From the harvesting grounds of Dhofar and Hadramaut, caravans loaded with frankincense travelled along the western edge of the peninsula, following the Hejaz highlands where water sources were more reliable and the terrain offered some protection from raiders. They passed through oasis cities that grew wealthy on the traffic: Shabwa, Marhib, Najran, Medina, each one extracting tolls and providing services and developing the infrastructure necessary to support the endless flow of goods and travellers. At the northern end of the route, the caravans reached Petra, the rose-red city carved into the cliffs of modern Jordan, where the Nabatean traders who controlled the final leg of the journey took their cut before sending the incense onward to Gaza and Alexandria and Rome. The scale of this trade is difficult to comprehend. The Roman Empire alone, at the height of its power, consumed an estimated 3,000 tons of frankincense per year. The resin was burned in temples to every god in the Roman pantheon. It was used in the homes of the wealthy to mask unpleasant odours and to create an atmosphere of luxury and refinement. It was prescribed by physicians for ailments ranging from digestive complaints to skin diseases. It was mixed into the embalming compounds that preserved the bodies of the dead, and every grain of it, every single particle, had to travel thousands of kilometres from the mountains of southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean world. The wealth that flowed back along those routes was staggering. The kingdoms that controlled the incense trade became fabulously rich enough to build cities and dams and irrigation systems, rich enough to maintain armies and support artisans and develop written languages to record their transactions. The Romans, looking southward toward the source of all this wealth, called the region Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia, Fortunate Arabia, a name that acknowledged both the prosperity of the land and the envy of those who wished they could control it. The second great economic engine was the Persian Gulf trade, connecting the civilizations of Mesopotamia to the markets of the Indus Valley and beyond. Long before the overland incense routes reached their peak, the waters of the Gulf had served as a highway for commerce, carrying goods and ideas and people between the great river civilizations of the Tigris-Euphrates and the equally sophisticated cultures of the Indus. The island of Bahrain and the eastern coast of Arabia formed the heart of this maritime network, and the civilization that flourished there, known to the Mesopotamians as Dilmun, became legendary for its wealth and its role as an intermediary between worlds. The Sumerians wrote of Dilmun as a place of almost mythological abundance, a land where the sun rose, where the waters were sweet, where the gods themselves had once walked. Archaeological evidence suggests that this reputation was not entirely exaggerated. The settlements of eastern Arabia during the Bronze Age were sophisticated and prosperous, trading copper and pearls and dates for the manufactured goods of Mesopotamia and the exotic products of the Indus. The Gulf was not a barrier but a bridge, and the peoples who controlled its waters grew rich on the traffic that flowed across it. The third economic engine was the overland spice trade, connecting the ports of southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean through a network of caravan routes that crisscrossed the peninsula. This trade overlapped with the incense routes but was distinct from them, carrying cinnamon and pepper and other spices that originated in India and Southeast Asia and were transshipped through Arabian ports before continuing northward. The merchants who controlled this traffic developed sophisticated systems of credit and exchange, of warehousing and transport, of protection and toll collection that would not be matched in complexity until the rise of the great trading companies of early modern Europe. Together, these three engines, the incense trade, the Gulf Maritime Network, and the overland spice routes, created the conditions for urban civilization to flourish across the Arabian Peninsula. Cities rose at the nodes of these networks, at the oases where water was available, and at the ports where ships could anchor, and at the mountain passes where caravans could be taxed and supplied. Kingdoms formed around the control of these choke points, and dynasties rose and fell based on their ability to maintain the flow of goods and the loyalty of the traders who moved them. The civilization that developed in southern Arabia by about 1000 BCE was among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. The kingdom of Saba, known to readers of the Old Testament as Sheba, the land of the queen who visited Solomon, was merely the most famous of several competing powers that controlled the incense trade and the agricultural wealth of the monsoon-fed highlands. These kingdoms built cities of stone and mud brick, developed alphabetic writing systems that would eventually give rise to the scripts of Ethiopia and the inscriptions of the Nabateans, constructed irrigation systems of remarkable engineering sophistication, and maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And yet, within a few centuries of the rise of Islam, almost all memory of these civilizations had been lost. The cities fell into ruin, the trade routes shifted or collapsed, the writing systems were forgotten, their inscriptions becoming mysterious marks on stone that no one could read. The peoples who had built and maintained these cultures were absorbed into new, political and religious frameworks that had little interest in preserving the memory of what had come before. The desert, patient and relentless, covered over the evidence and erased the traces. What remained were legends, stories of wealthy kingdoms and powerful rulers, of cities destroyed by divine wrath and peoples annihilated for their sins, of treasures buried beneath the sand and secrets waiting to be uncovered. The Quran preserved these legends in theological form, insisting that the ruins were still there, that the evidence of God's judgment could still be read in the landscape by those with eyes to see. The medieval Arab geographers preserved fragments of the old knowledge, recording place names and tribal genealogies, and half-remembered traditions about the peoples who had lived in Arabia before Islam. But the systematic, detailed understanding of these civilizations, who they were, how they lived, what they accomplished, why they fell, was lost. The domestication of the camel had made the incense trade possible, allowing merchants to cross vast stretches of waterless desert with loads of precious cargo. The development of the camel saddle, capable of supporting heavy weights over long distances, had transformed the economics of overland transport and created the conditions for the great caravan cities to flourish. But the same animals that had built Arabian civilization also made it possible to bypass it. When maritime technology improved sufficiently to allow ships to sail directly from the Red Sea ports of Egypt to the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia and beyond, the overland routes that had sustained the caravan cities for centuries began to decline. The wealth that had flowed through Petra and Mada'in Saleh and Ubar found other channels, and the cities that had grown fat on the traffic withered and died. Climate change played its role as well. The monsoon patterns that had brought rain to the mountains of Yemen and Oman shifted over centuries, reducing the agricultural productivity of regions that had once supported large populations. The aquifers that had made desert oases habitable were depleted by overuse, their waters drawn down faster than they could be replenished. The limestone caverns beneath cities like Ubar, carved out by millennia of water flow, collapsed when the water that had supported them was gone. The land itself seemed to turn against the civilizations that had flourished upon it, and then came the political and religious transformations that would reshape the peninsula entirely. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE created a new framework for understanding Arabian history, one that looked forward to the community of believers rather than backward to the kingdoms of the past. The destroyed peoples became moral lessons rather than historical subjects, their ruins evidence of divine judgment rather than opportunities for archaeological investigation. The languages they had spoken, the scripts they had written, the gods they had worshipped, all of these became relics of a Jahiliyyah, an age of ignorance that the new faith had superseded and replaced. For 13 centuries the buried civilizations of Arabia remained buried. Travellers occasionally noted the ruins they passed, the carved facades of Mada'in Saleh, the crumbling walls of forgotten cities, the inscriptions in unknown scripts that decorated cliff faces and tomb entrances. But systematic investigation was rare and usually superficial. The desert was hostile, the political situation unstable, and the intellectual framework for understanding what might be found was lacking. The pre-Islamic past was a void, a blank space on the map of human history, and most scholars were content to leave it that way. But the void was never truly empty. The ruins were still there, as the Quran had always insisted. The inscriptions were still legible, waiting for someone to learn how to read them. The artifacts were still buried beneath the sand, preserving information about peoples and cultures that had left no other record of their existence. And in the 20th century, as new technologies emerged and new questions were asked, and new political realities made access possible, the buried world of pre-Islamic Arabia began, slowly and incompletely, to emerge into the light. The satellite image that led to the discovery of Ubar was not an accident. It was the product of decades of technological development, of scientific curiosity, of a willingness to look at familiar landscapes with new eyes. The radar instruments that peered through the sand and revealed the ancient caravan tracks were designed for other purposes entirely, for studying geological formations, for mapping terrain, for military reconnaissance. But they proved capable of seeing what human eyes had missed for millennia. The past, it turned out, had not been erased. It had merely been hidden, waiting for the right tools and the right questions to bring it back. What those tools revealed was not a single lost city, but an entire lost world. Ubar was merely the beginning, the most dramatic confirmation of what the legends had always claimed. Across the Arabian Peninsula, from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Yemen, from the cliffs of the Hejaz to the dunes of the Empty Quarter, the evidence of forgotten civilizations lay waiting to be found. Cities and tombs and temples, inscriptions and artifacts and human remains, the accumulated debris of 3,000 years of human habitation in a land the modern world had written off as eternally barren. The Quran's condemned cities were real. The peoples it named, Ad and Thamud, the builders of towers and the carvers of mountains, had existed, had flourished, had created works of engineering and art that still astonish those who encounter them today. Their destruction, whatever its ultimate cause, had left physical evidence that could be excavated and studied and understood. And the scripture that had preserved their memory, when read not as mythology but as geography, turned out to be a remarkably accurate guide to where that evidence could be found. This is the story of that evidence, and of the people who found it. This is the story of satellites and shovels, of ancient texts and modern technology, of a buried world dragged back into the light after millennia of silence. The sand has begun to speak, and what it says will change everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. To find where the sand first began to speak, one must travel not to the deserts of the interior, but to a small island in the Persian Gulf, a place where the salt water meets the sweet, where springs bubble up through the shallow seabed and dilute the brine with fresh cold streams that sailors have known and blessed for 5,000 years. This is Bahrain, and beneath its modern skyline of glass towers and shopping malls and highways lies the oldest nameplace in human literature. The Sumerians called it Dilmun. They wrote of it on clay tablets in the temple of Inanna at Uruk, tablets baked hard by fire and buried by time, and dug up again in the 19th century by archaeologists who did not yet know what they were reading. Dilmun, the tablet said, was the place where the sun rises. Dilmun was pure. Dilmun was the land of the living. In Dilmun the raven did not croak, the lion did not kill, the wolf did not seize the lamb. In Dilmun no one grew old. In Dilmun there was no death. The description is arresting. It is, in every meaningful sense, the earliest surviving written account of paradise on earth, predating the Garden of Eden of Genesis, predating the Elysian fields of the Greeks, predating even the flood narrative of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the form we now possess. And unlike those later paradises, which existed only in the imagination of their tellers, Dilmun was a real place. The Sumerians traded with it. They sent ships to it and received ships from it. They knew its rulers by name and recorded their tributes. King Onanshi of Lagash, ruling around 2300 BCE, inscribed a boast that the ships of Dilmun brought him timber from foreign lands, and that inscription survives, one of the earliest specific references to the mysterious island paradise, at the edge of the Sumerian world. For 4,000 years the tablets sat in the earth, and Dilmun sat in the mind of scholarship as a kind of geographic puzzle, a place mentioned constantly in Mesopotamian records, but never quite pinned to any modern location. Some suggested the coast of Iran, others proposed the Indus Valley. A few argued it was purely mythological, a Sumerian daydream projected onto no real geography at all. And then, in 1953, a Danish expedition led by Peter Wilhelm Glob, professor at Aarhus University, arrived in Bahrain with an English-born colleague named Thomas Jeffrey Bibby, and they began, methodically, to dig. What they found across the following 2 decades would transform Dilmun from a literary conjecture into an archaeological certainty. The site that anchored their investigation rises on the northern shore of the island, a low tell called Qalat al-Bahrain, the Fort of Bahrain, named for the Portuguese citadel that crowns its summit. Beneath that citadel, the Danes discovered lay layer upon layer of earlier habitation, a stratified record of continuous occupation stretching back to roughly 2300 BCE, 45 acres of city buried in the mound, streets and workshops and warehouses, copper ingots stamped with weights that matched the standards used in distant Mesopotamian markets, seals carved in the distinctive round Dilmun style, showing bulls and antelopes and the enigmatic figures of a maritime pantheon, and beneath it all, running through the strata like veins of silver, evidence of the freshwater springs that had made the whole civilization possible, the sweet waters welling up from a hidden aquifer, exactly as the Sumerian texts had described. The temple hymns spoke of Enki, god of fresh water, opening the springs beneath the salt to make Dilmun bloom. The archaeologists standing in the trenches at Qalat al-Bahrain found themselves looking at the physical infrastructure of that hymn. But it was not the city that made the deepest impression on the Danish expedition. It was the mounds. Bahrain, when Bibby first surveyed it, was carpeted in low earthen tumuli, thousands upon thousands of them, marching across the interior of the island in dense fields that stretched for miles. 19th century scholars encountering these mounds had struggled to understand them. Some had proposed that Bahrain was not a homeland at all, but a great necropolis, a sacred island where the Mesopotamians ferried their dead across the gulf for burial in holy ground. The theory made a certain narrative sense, a paradise island where the sun rises would be a fitting resting place. But it also seemed extravagant. Could a whole island really have served as nothing but a graveyard for a foreign civilization? Bibby's excavations answered the question, and the answer was more complicated and more remarkable than either extreme. The mounds were tombs, yes, tens of thousands of them, constituting one of the largest Bronze Age necropolises anywhere on Earth. But they were not the tombs of Mesopotamian foreigners shipped in for burial. They were the tombs of Dilmunites themselves, generation after generation of an indigenous population that had lived and died on the island across 2 millennia. The mounds were the physical accumulation of a culture's memory of itself. Every family, every clan, every village had raised its stones over its dead, and the dead had piled up in numbers that testified to a population and a duration that no one had previously credited to this small, hot, arid island in the middle of the Gulf. Consider the arithmetic. Consider what it means for a Bronze Age community to sustain itself long enough, densely enough, ritually enough, to leave behind mounds numbering in the tens of thousands. This was not a way station. This was not a myth. This was a civilization. And what a civilization it must have been. The location alone dictated the shape of its economy. Dilmun sat astride the maritime route between Sumer to the north and Meluha, almost certainly the Indus Valley, to the east, a route along which ships carried copper from Oman, timber from India, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan filtering down through the mountain caravans, pearls from the Gulf oyster beds, and grain and textiles from the Mesopotamian floodplains. Dilmun was the pivot on which this trade turned. Ships put in at its harbours to take on fresh water from those miraculous springs, to unload cargoes for transshipment, to wait out unfavourable winds. The city at Qalat al-Bahrain grew rich as a broker, taking a percentage of everything that passed through, becoming, in the language of a much later age, the Singapore of the Bronze Age Gulf. Comparable to the great trading emporia of later antiquity, comparable to the caravan cities of the Silk Road, comparable to the Phoenician ports of the Mediterranean, Dilmun performed the same essential function millennia earlier. Its merchants spoke the languages of half a dozen cultures. Its priests worshipped in temples whose architecture blended Sumerian and local traditions into something distinct. Its craftsmen produced those extraordinary round seals carved from soft chlorite and steatite that turn up in archaeological sites from Mesopotamia to the Indus, marking the passage of Dilmun-brokered goods across a network that spanned the ancient East. And yet, for all its wealth and reach, Dilmun retained, in the Sumerian imagination, the aura of something more than commercial. It was pure, it was sacred, it was the place where the sun rises. The traders who returned from it brought back not only goods but stories, and those stories seeped into the mythology of Mesopotamia, and, through Mesopotamia, into every subsequent tradition of paradise the human race has invented. Standing today on the walls of Qalat al-Bahrain, looking out across the shallow turquoise waters of the Gulf toward the modern causeway that connects Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, one feels the strange doubleness of the place. On one hand, this is an ordinary island, small and unremarkable, hemmed in by oil derricks and airport runways. On the other hand, this is a threshold, a place where the deepest layer of literary memory in the human record touches, without ambiguity, a physical location one can walk across and dig into and measure. The oldest paradise story in the world had a postal address. It was here, and the excavations of Glob and Bibi, patient and unglamorous and stretched across decades, proved it. The precedent this establishes for everything that follows is difficult to overstate. If Dilmun, a place named in tablets 4,000 years old, a place described in language so mythic that scholars long dismissed it as pure fantasy, could be located, excavated and confirmed, then what else might be waiting? What other legendary geographies dismissed by generations of skeptics might turn out to have foundations of stone and mortar beneath their veils of myth? The methodology had been tested. The texts, read carefully and paired with the right kind of fieldwork, could deliver real cities. Could they also deliver Iram? Could they deliver the towered dwellings of the Ad? Could they deliver everything the Quran had insisted was real, and everything the classical Arabic geographers had insisted was findable, if only one knew where to look? To follow that thread, one must travel south now, out of the Gulf, and around the great curve of the Arabian coast, past the barren cliffs of the Muzandam Peninsula, past the trading dhows of the Omani shore, and down into a green and improbable landscape at the very southern edge of the peninsula. This is Dhofar, a narrow ribbon of monsoon-fed hills where clouds gather each summer against the escarpments and drop enough rain to sustain a strip of vegetation utterly unlike anything else in Arabia. Here, in the folds of the Dhofar Mountains, in valleys where the mist collects at dawn and burns off by mid-morning, grows a tree that has shaped the destiny of the entire peninsula. Its bark is pale and papery, its branches twist as if in pain, its leaves are small and modest, and when the bark is scored with a curved blade, the tree weeps a thick milky resin that hardens over days into translucent golden tears. This is Boswellia sacra, this is frankincense, and Dhofar, alone among the regions of the earth, produces it in a quality and quantity that made it, for 3,000 years, the most valuable commodity in the ancient world. The scale of that value is difficult to grasp at first. Frankincense in Roman-era markets sold, weight for weight, at prices comparable to gold and sometimes exceeding it. Emperors burned it at funerals in quantities that beggared provincial treasurers. Temples in Egypt, in Persia, in Greece, in every corner of the Mediterranean consumed it in ritual quantities that had to be renewed year after year. Roman physicians prescribed it for every ailment from digestive complaints to grief, and every gram of it, every fragment of every golden tear, originated in a mountain zone no larger than a modest European country, tucked away in the southern extremity of Arabia. The trees would not grow elsewhere. Attempts to transplant them failed. The particular combination of monsoon moisture, limestone soil, altitude, and mineral chemistry that produced the finest resin existed nowhere else on Earth. Dhofar was, by geological accident, the sole supplier to a world addicted to smoke. What this meant for the peoples of southern Arabia was staggering. A tribe that controlled a valley of Boswellia sacra was, in economic terms, a tribe that owned an oil field. The resin had to be harvested at the right season, cured for weeks in stone rooms, sorted by grade, packed into sacks, and moved. And the moving was the hard part. From the harvest zones in the interior mountains, the frankincense had to travel, first down to coastal ports for shipment by sea, and second along the great overland caravan routes that carried it north through the empty quarter, up the western spine of Arabia, and eventually to the markets of the Mediterranean. The infrastructure required to move this commodity at the scale demanded by the ancient world was staggering. Roads had to be maintained, though the Arabs did not build roads as the Romans did. Instead, they maintained wells, they maintained way stations, they maintained the political relationships with tribes along the route that allowed caravans to pass unmolested. Camels had to be bred and trained by the thousands, water had to be stored, guides had to be paid. And at the far ends of the system, at the coastal loading docks and the inland caravan termini, cities had to be built. Sumerum was one such city. It rises today on the eastern bank of a lagoon called Khor Rori, a few dozen kilometres east of the modern Omani city of Salalah, where a creek meets the Indian Ocean through a narrow inlet that once opened to the sea but is now silted shut. The site had been noticed by travellers for generations. The walls are visible, the outlines of buildings are clear against the coastal plain, but systematic excavation waited until 1994, when an Italian mission from the University of Pisa, working under the direction of scholars who would spend the next 2 decades on the site, began to peel back its secrets. The Italian mission to Oman, as the project came to be known, has now conducted more than 20 years of continuous research at Sumhuram, and what it has revealed is a small walled, tightly planned city that served from roughly the 3rd century BCE onward as the primary maritime outlet for frankincense produced in the Hadramaut kingdom to the west. The walls of Sumhuram, encircling a compact urban core, contain a dense pattern of streets and squares, workshops and warehouses, dwelling quarters and monumental buildings. A temple stands within the enclosure, dedicated, as inscriptions on its stones make clear, to the South Arabian moon god Sin, patron deity of the Hadramite ruling dynasty. Stone dedications, carved in the elegant angular script of the South Arabian alphabet, record the names of officials and the dates of construction. Storage rooms held the frankincense as it awaited shipment. Alleyways led down toward what would have been, in antiquity, a small harbour where flat-bottomed boats could load resin for transport out through the inlet and onto the Indian Ocean trade routes. The trade routes themselves are what make Sumhuram genuinely astonishing. The Italian excavators have documented material connections stretching in every direction. Pottery from the Hadramite homeland to the west, obviously enough. But also pottery from India, from the great trading ports of the Malabar coast, arriving in Sumhuram as ballast or as merchant goods, and left behind when the ships were reloaded with frankincense for the return voyage. Amphorae from the Mediterranean, or their fragments, testifying to the reach of a commercial network that ran from the shores of the Arabian Sea to the docks of Alexandria and beyond. Coins, seals, glassware, beads, the small material vocabulary of an interconnected ancient world, all of it accumulated in this little walled town at the edge of the incense-bearing hills. The impression Sumhuram gives the visitor today is one of surprising compactness. The city is not large. One can walk its perimeter in 15 minutes, and yet through this small aperture flowed, for centuries, a commodity that shaped the economies of empires. Ships put in through the inlet, took on cargoes worth more than their own weight in silver, and sailed away for ports whose names, Muziris, Aden, Berenike, Alexandria, spoke of a maritime civilization stretching halfway around the known world. And in the mountains behind the port, tribes gathered the resin from their trees and sent it down the passes on caravans of camels, generation after generation, until the day came when the port silted up, when the sandbar closed the inlet in the 5th century of the Common Era, when the ships stopped coming and the city was slowly, quietly abandoned to the sand and the wind. But Sumhuram is only half the picture. The port faced the sea. The other half of the frankincense economy faced inland, north into the desert, along overland caravan routes that carried resin from the Dhofar coast, up through the barren wastes of the interior toward the Mediterranean markets of the north. And it is here, in this inland trade, that Ubar takes its place in the picture. The many-towered fortress that Nicholas Clapp and Juris Zarins had begun to uncover at Shiso was not, it now becomes clear, an anomaly. It was a node, perhaps the crucial node, in exactly this system. Ubar's towers looked out over caravan tracks that ran, satellite radar had confirmed, in every direction across the sands. Its warehouses stored the resin that had been carried up from the coast. Its wells provided the water without which no camel train could survive the crossing of the empty quarter. And its collapse, when the aquifer failed and the limestone cavern beneath the fortress gave way, took with it not just a city, but a switching point in a network of trade that had bound southern Arabia to the wider world for millennia. The commodity that built these cities, Ubar in the interior, Sumhuram on the coast, and half a dozen other settlements now emerging along the incense routes, was frankincense. The wealth that raised the walls, that hired the masons, that funded the temples to Sin and to the other South Arabian deities, that supported the scribes who inscribed the stone dedications and the merchants who tallied the loads on parchment ledgers now lost to time. All of this wealth flowed from one source, from one tree, from one narrow strip of monsoon-watered mountains at the edge of an otherwise unforgiving land. The Roman world called it a luxury. The Egyptian world called it a necessity of religion. The Arabian world called it quite simply the tree, and built its civilization around it. When the demand collapsed, when Christianity displaced the temple cults that had consumed the resin in such quantities, when maritime routes bypassed the caravan cities, when the aquifers failed and the ports silted up, the civilization collapsed with it. What was left, buried in the sand and preserved in the memory of poets and prophets, was the story of what had once been. And that story, when it comes to the peoples who inhabited these lands and built these cities, takes its most vivid and consequential form in the Quran's account of the Ad. The scripture returns to them repeatedly, in verse after verse across multiple chapters, with a persistence that suggests their memory was still fresh in the audiences of 7th century Arabia. The most detailed description comes in Surah Al-Fajr, the 89th chapter, in verses 6 through 10. The Quran asks rhetorically whether the listener has considered how the Lord dealt with Ad, with Iram of the pillars whose like had never been created in the lands. Iram Dat al-Imad, the city of pillars. The phrase is dense and difficult to translate, carrying connotations of towering columns, of monumental architecture, of a city whose vertical construction dwarfed anything else the ancient world had produced. And the people of Ad, the scripture insists, matched their city. They were men of great stature, tall as the pillars they raised, unmatched in any other land, a people of extraordinary physical presence, extraordinary craft, extraordinary hubris. The stories that classical Arabic tradition wove around this Quranic core are elaborate and specific. Al-Hamdani, the 10th century geographer of Yemen, wrote of ancient cities in the southern desert, whose ruins the tribe still avoided. Al-Masudi, the great historian and traveller, catalogued oral traditions about the Ad and their homeland, always locating them somewhere in the vast blank space of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, always somewhere beyond the last well, beyond the last village, beyond the reach of anyone who might return to confirm the tale. Ibn Kathir, in his commentary on the Quran, described how the violent windstorm that God sent against the Ad had raged for 7 nights and 8 days, tearing the once lush and green region to ruins and burying it beneath the sands. Al-Qurtubi called it a cataclysmic tempest, and the tradition was clear on the cause. The Ad had rejected the Prophet Hud, whom Allah had sent to warn them. They had trusted in their towers and their strength and their unmatched works, and their arrogance had brought upon them a destruction so complete that only the desert itself remained to mark where they had been. The literary treatment of Iram reached its most famous elaboration in 1001 Nights, in the tale of Abdullah ibn Abi Kilaba, a Bedouin who, according to the story, wandered into the empty quarter in search of a lost camel and stumbled upon a city of impossible splendour, its walls of gold and silver, its columns rising higher than the mind could measure, its gates open and its streets utterly deserted. He filled his saddlebags with treasure and rode home to tell his tale, and the caliph in Damascus, hearing the account, is said to have consulted his scholars, who confirmed that this was indeed Iram, glimpsed one last time before God concealed it once more from the eyes of men. The story is a fable, of course, a piece of literary fiction. But what is striking about it is how specific it is in its geography. The narrator did not place Iram in some vague other world. He placed it quite firmly in the Rub al-Khali. He placed it in a real desert, on the map of a real Arabia, in the same landscape where the modern satellite would eventually find the ruins of Ubar. For centuries, Western scholarship treated all of this as pure legend. The Quranic account was theology. The classical Arabic accounts were embroidery on theology. The 1001 Nights version was frank fabrication. There was no reason, most Orientalists concluded, to suppose that any actual city corresponded to the description. The Ad were mythological giants, Iram was a moral allegory, and the desert was empty, as it had always been empty, its blankness offering no purchase for archaeological hope. But this dismissal, comfortable as it was, sat uneasily against certain stubborn facts. The Quran, when it named other destroyed peoples, the Thamud for instance, turned out to be pointing at real archaeological sites whose ruins were visible and datable and increasingly well understood. The classical geographers, when they described the trade routes and the wells and the tribal territories of pre-Islamic Arabia, turned out to be broadly accurate, their information based on genuine transmitted knowledge rather than pure invention. Why then should the account of Iram and the Ad be uniquely fictional? Why should this one legend, among so many that had proven to have geographic and material substance, be the exception? The question hung in the air, unanswered, through most of the 20th century. It hung there while explorers crossed and recrossed the fringes of the empty quarter, finding traces but never the fortress city itself. It hung there while linguists deciphered the South Arabian inscriptions and pushed the frontier of documented history further back into the pre-Islamic past. It hung there while the tribes of Dhofar continued, quietly and largely unnoticed, to harvest their frankincense from trees whose ancestors had supplied the empires of antiquity. And it was still hanging there when, in the late 20th century, a filmmaker named Nicholas Clapp opened a book about the legend of Ubar and began, without quite knowing where his curiosity would lead him, to ask whether the new eyes of orbital technology might see what the eyes of every previous seeker had missed. Nicholas Clapp was not an archaeologist. He was not a geologist, nor a linguist, nor a classicist, with a chair at a university and decades of fieldwork behind him. He was a documentary filmmaker based in Los Angeles, with a stubborn habit of following a question wherever it led, regardless of how unreasonable the destination appeared to other people. In the early 1980s, the question that had taken hold of him was this: could a lost city that the Quran described, that medieval poets had immortalized, and that Bedouin memory had preserved in fragments of oral tradition, actually be found? Not imagined, not theorized, not spoken about in the hedged and cautious language of academic possibility, but found, mapped, physically excavated, and proven real in the way that Pompeii was real, or or any of the ancient cities that had once seemed irretrievably gone and had eventually yielded their secrets to the right combination of curiosity and method. Clapp began where every serious researcher begins, in libraries. He spent years accumulating the textual record, laying the medieval accounts alongside the classical ones, cross-referencing the Quranic verses against the reports of Arabian travellers, building a slow, patient dossier of every place name and every direction, and every hint of ruined masonry that had ever attached itself to the story. He read Nashwan al-Himyari and Yaqut al-Hamawi, and the medieval geographers who had catalogued the folklore of the peninsula with the same methodical care that Renaissance scholars brought to the Greek and Roman classics. He read Bertram Thomas, the first Westerner to cross the empty quarter, whose 1932 account included a Bedouin guide pointing at faint tracks in the sand and pronouncing the word Ubar. He read Wilfred Thesiger. He read the Arabian Nights, and out of all this reading he built a working hypothesis that the legend had geographic weight, that its persistence across so many independent sources suggested an underlying reality, and that if the reality still existed, it would exist somewhere in the northern approaches to the empty quarter, somewhere along the frankincense road, somewhere the sand had not entirely swallowed. The rest of the story, the satellite images, the radar returns, the caravans converging on Shissa, the walls 2 feet thick, the tower stumps rising like broken teeth from the collapsed cavern floor, had followed from that patient library work as consequence follows cause. The press, when it came in a rush. Newspapers in London, New York, Cairo and Riyadh carried the headline in various inflections of the same word: Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands, the lost city of 1,000 pillars, found at last. Fiennes gave interviews, Clapp gave interviews, cameras were flown out to Shissa, and the ruined tower stumps were filmed from every angle, and the world briefly entertained the extraordinary possibility that a Quranic legend had proved literally true, and then, as almost always happens when a discovery of this magnitude enters the slow furnace of scholarly assessment, the ground began to shift beneath it. certain archaeologists reading the reports with the cool eye of professional habit found the identification troubling. K. Pragg, writing in the journal Arabian Archaeology and Epigraphy, was among the voices that raised the awkward, necessary question: was Shisar really a city at all? The medieval Arabic sources described Iram of the Pillars as a place of extraordinary grandeur, a metropolis whose columns rivaled those of the greatest capitals of the ancient world, whose gardens and towers had been reared up by a people the Quran itself described as taller and stronger than any nation before them. Shisar, when one measured it soberly, was something considerably more modest: a fortified caravanserai, a well station with towers and walls, a hub, undeniably, of the frankincense trade, but a hub in the sense of a way station, a stopping point, a place where caravans watered their camels and stored their goods before the next leg of the journey. Not a metropolis. Not, on any reasonable reading of the archaeology, a place that would have justified the language of the legend. The critics pointed out the modest scale of the walls. They pointed out that the pottery, striking as it was in its international range, shards from Rome, Greece, Persia, China, Egypt, spoke of trade rather than of population. They pointed out that no inscriptions had yet been recovered that named the site as Ubar or Iram or anything else that could be tied to the legend by anything more than inference. And they pointed out, with the faint reproach that scholars reserve for enthusiasms that have escaped into the press, that Clapp and Fiennes had allowed the headlines to run considerably ahead of what the ground itself was willing to say. Zarins himself, the professional archaeologist on the team, the man whose training and instincts had been formed in the more sceptical disciplines, was notably more careful in his public language than his non-specialist collaborators. He spoke of Shisar as a hub of the frankincense trade. He spoke of it as a caravan station of great commercial significance. He did not, when pressed, insist that it was Iram of the Pillars, and in later years he grew increasingly explicit about his caution. In a 1996 interview with the American documentary program Nova, Zarins offered a linguistic clarification that would prove central to the debate. There was, he said, a great deal of confusion about the word Ubar. If one read the classical texts carefully, and read the Arab historical sources alongside them, one saw that Ubar was not the name of a specific town. It was the name of a region and of a group of people. It described a territory and its inhabitants, rather than a city that one could walk into through a particular gate. And this shift in meaning, from city to territory, from named metropolis to broader landscape, was not a retreat but a refocusing. It brought the archaeological find at Shisar into a more sustainable relationship with the ancient sources. Shisar was not, in this reading, the fabled city of 1,000 pillars. It was one important settlement within a wider region, a region that the classical geographer Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, had called the land of the Iobarite. The word Iobarite, when one traced it through the mutations of Greek transcription and Arabic pronunciation, could be recognized as a version of Ubar, or of the people the Arabs called the Ubarites, and the territory they were said to inhabit. In 2007, a paper partly authored by Zarins made this reading explicit. Ubar was more properly understood as a region than as a city. The confusion between the two, between a place name that described a landscape and a place name that described a fortress, had been the source of the entire mismatch between the legend and the excavation. The legend had spoken of a city because storytellers prefer cities to territories, because a city can be destroyed in a single spectacular judgment, whereas a region merely fades, and because the human imagination reaches more readily for walls and towers than for the diffuse geography of a caravan zone. The archaeology, meanwhile, had found what the archaeology could find: a specific site, a specific fortress, a specific set of walls and towers within the larger region that the ancients had called by that name. The site at Shisar, in this more careful reading, was neither triumphantly the lost city nor embarrassingly a nothing. It was a piece, a real, datable, materially rich piece, of a larger reality that had once existed in exactly the place the sources said it had existed. And this, perhaps, is the more truthful shape that discoveries of this kind tend to take in the end. The headline resolves into a paragraph. The paragraph resolves into a footnote. The footnote is more interesting than the headline had been, but it is quieter, and its interest is not the kind that survives the front page. In 2000, The site was inscribed by UNESCO as part of the Land of Frankincense World Heritage designation, which included the ruins at Shissa alongside the coastal port of Sumhuram, the ancient harbour of Khor Rori, and the frankincense-producing landscapes of Wadi Dauka. The site's occupation, as excavation and radiocarbon work refined the picture, was traced back to roughly 300 years before the Common Era. This was not a Bronze Age antiquity, not a city contemporary with the pyramids or with Dilmun's Sumerian correspondence. It was later, considerably later, a settlement that flourished across the classical and late antique centuries, whose collapse in the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era belonged to the same broad horizon as the fading of the frankincense economy itself. There was no evidence, at Shissa, of a metropolis on the scale that the legend described. There was equally no evidence that the legend was pure invention. There was instead the harder and more useful thing, a real place, in the right region, at a plausible period, whose disappearance under a collapsed cavern floor supplied a plausible material substrate for the tradition of divine destruction. What the desert had preserved was smaller than the story, but it was not nothing, and the fact that the story had persisted, had travelled through centuries of oral and literary transmission, had crossed languages and empires and confessional boundaries, and had ended by pointing an American filmmaker with a satellite image at a specific spot in the Omani desert where genuine ancient walls did in fact lie buried. This was a form of vindication that, if it was less than the headlines promised, was still remarkable enough to sit with. This tension, between the story and the stone, will run beneath every site we visit in this journey. Every identification will be contested, every headline will be tempered by a footnote, every ruin will be smaller than the legend that draws us to it, and every legend will be more grounded in real geography than the skeptics who first dismissed it. The truth of pre-Islamic Arabia, when one finally puts the fragments together, is neither the mythic Arabia of the Quran nor the empty Arabia of Western imagination. It is the harder, more interesting middle, a landscape of real cities, real trade routes, real destroyed peoples, whose destruction did not always take the theological shape the later traditions gave it, but whose material lives were rich, particular, and well documented in the record if one knows how to look. So we leave Ubar, or the land of the Ubarite, or whatever one chooses to call the vanished commercial world that Shissa represents. We leave the ambiguity of the sands and the argument in the pages of Arabian archaeology and epigraphy, and we travel northwestward, out of Dhofar, up along the western flank of the peninsula, into a very different landscape and a very different kind of civilization. The land here rises. The coastal plain of the Red Sea gives way to volcanic hills, to lava fields dark against the ochre of the desert, to the Hejaz, the range that runs like a spine down the western edge of the Arabian Shield. Its wade is carved into the sandstone by the seasonal violence of stormwater, its horizons broken by mesas and outcrops of red and gold rock. This is a country of caravans and of pilgrimage, a country whose valleys have channeled the movement of goods and ideas between the Yemen and the Levant for as long as there has been trade at all. And it is in this country, sometime in the 4th century before the Common Era, that the historical record first catches sight of a people who would within 200 years build one of the most spectacular cities the ancient world would ever see. Their name was preserved in Greek as the Nabateans. Diodorus Siculus, the Sicilian historian writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, is the earliest surviving source who describes them, and he places the earliest datable episode of their history in the year 312 before the Common Era. The account is brief, vivid, and militarily embarrassing for its Macedonian protagonists. Antigonus the One-Eyed, one of the successor generals of Alexander the Great, had inherited a share of Alexander's empire and cast a hungry eye toward the wealth of the Arabian caravan trade. The Nabateans, at this point, were not city builders. They were nomads. They lived in tents. They spoke Arabic. They kept their treasures, their silver, their myrrh, their frankincense, in a defensible rock, a natural fortress somewhere in the desert east of the Dead Sea, and they conducted the long-distance trade that carried Yemeni resins north to the Mediterranean markets. Antigonus, hearing of this concentration of wealth, dispatched his officer Athenaeus with 4,000 foot and 600 horse to seize it. The raid, at first, succeeded. The Greeks arrived when the Nabatean men were away at a seasonal gathering, and Athenaeus looted, by Diodorus's account, tons of spices and quantities of silver. He withdrew, encumbered by his plunder, and made camp roughly 200 stadia from the Nabatean stronghold, a distance he apparently considered safe. It was not safe. 8,000 Nabatean warriors, alerted to the theft, pursued through the desert with the speed that only a people at home in that terrain can manage. They fell upon the Macedonian camp at night. The 4,000 foot soldiers were slain, every one of them. Athenaeus himself was killed, the plunder was recovered, and the Nabateans, in a single night of counterattack, had announced themselves to the Hellenistic world as a power that could not be casually raided, a people whose command of their own desert made them nearly untouchable. This is the first written glimpse of them, and it is worth pausing on the details. They were nomads, but they were organised enough to muster 8,000 fighters and to coordinate a night attack. They were Arabic-speaking, but they were engaged in trade of a scale that made them worth robbing. They were tent dwellers, but they had a stronghold, a rock, a defensible place, where their accumulated wealth was kept. In these details, one can already see the outline of what they would become. Within 2 centuries, the tents would give way to monumental architecture. The rock would become Petra. The stronghold would become a capital. The trade networks would extend from Damascus in the north to Hegra in the south, from the interior deserts to the Mediterranean coast at Gaza, and the Nabatean kingdom at its height would rival, in geographic reach and commercial sophistication, any of the successor states of Alexander's fragmented empire. But this is the end of the story, not the beginning. To reach Petra, one has to travel through Petra's origins, and the origins are not in Jordan. They are, on the best current reading, further south, in the Hejaz, in the northwest of the Arabian Peninsula, in the country of oases and sandstone and lava fields that had been home to Semitic peoples for centuries before the Nabateans became visible to the Greek historians. The linguistic evidence points in this direction. The root NBTW, from which the name Nabatean is derived, appears in early Semitic languages of the Hejaz. The deities the Nabateans worshipped, Dushara, Al-Uzza and others, were shared with, or descended from, the older religious cultures of northwest Arabia, rather than the Levantine pantheons to their north, and the earliest inscriptions in a recognisably Nabatean script and language are found not at Petra, but at sites further south, in the country the classical geographers included in Arabia proper. What this suggests is that the Nabateans, before they built the rock-cut city that would astonish the ancient world and the modern tourist industry alike, were an Arabian people. They emerged out of the same broader civilizational matrix that produced the Sabaeans and the Minoans and the caravan traders of the incense road. They moved north, over generations following the trade, or the trade followed them, until their territory came to include the crucial junction where the incense road met the Mediterranean, at the place we now call Petra. But their homeland, their older heartland, lay to the south. And the second great city of their kingdom, the city that reveals them as originally Arabian rather than Levantine, lay in that homeland, at Hegra, in the northwest of what is now Saudi Arabia, 22 kilometers from the oasis town of Al-Ula. The Nabateans, in the Hejaz, did not simply build, they farmed. At Hegra, and in the surrounding wadis, they undertook a sophisticated regime of irrigated agriculture that turned the arid sandstone country into a garden of considerable productivity. They cultivated palm trees, they grew cereals and legumes, they raised fruit trees, they planted cotton, a crop that requires substantial water and careful management, and they made it flourish in a landscape that unassisted receives only the barest annual rainfall. This agricultural achievement, so easy to overlook beside the theatrical splendour of the tombs, was the material base on which everything else was built. A caravan city that cannot feed itself is a caravan city dependent on its neighbours, and the Nabateans, by mastering the water of their region, achieved a self-sufficiency that made them politically as well as commercially formidable. On top of this agricultural foundation ran the trade. The frankincense and myrrh of Yemen, the spices of the Indian Ocean, the silks and perfumes and rare goods that moved along the caravan routes from the ports of the Hadramaut northward. All of this passed through the Nabatean network, and the Nabateans took their percentage at every stage. The route ran from the incense-producing coasts of southern Arabia up along the western flank of the peninsula, through a chain of oases and way stations to Hegra, and from Hegra it continued northward to Petra, and from Petra westward across the Sinai to the Mediterranean at Gaza, where the goods were loaded onto ships bound for the markets of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. This was the Nabatean economy: agriculture at home, taxation of the caravans in transit, and the sale of the desert's most valuable commodities at the far end of the network. It made them, for a time, one of the richest small kingdoms in the ancient world, and it turned Hegra, the southern city, into something quite specific and quite extraordinary. Hegra was not, as the older accounts sometimes suggested, a mere provincial outpost of the Nabatean state. It was the kingdom's second city, the great southern capital of the caravan network, the point at which the incense road entered Nabatean territory, and the point at which the wealth of Arabia began to be organised and taxed and channelled toward the north. Its monumental tombs were carved out of the surrounding sandstone cliffs by craftsmen working in the same rock-cutting tradition that would produce the treasury and the monastery at Petra, but on a scale and with a corpus of dated inscriptions that Petra itself, for reasons that remain obscure, does not preserve. And the site of Hegra, once the Nabatean kingdom fell under Roman authority in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and the trade network slowly reorganised around new corridors, was gradually abandoned, its tombs left standing in the sandstone, its inscriptions weathering under the sun, its silence broken only by the wind. Modern Arabic knows this place as Mada'in Saleh. The name means the cities of Saleh, and it invokes a Quranic prophet whose story is set precisely in this landscape. Saleh, in the Quran's telling, was sent to warn the people of Thamud, a nation who dwelt in the rocks, who carved their houses into the sandstone cliffs, who lived in stone-cut chambers, and who were destroyed by divine judgment for the crime of hamstringing a miraculous she-camel that God had sent them as a test. The parallel with the physical landscape of Hegra is unmistakable. Here are rock-cut chambers, here are dwellings and tombs hewn into the sandstone. Here is exactly the kind of stone city that the Quran's description of Thamud brings to mind. And so, in the religious geography that developed in the Islamic centuries, this place became the place. The site where Saleh had preached, where the she-camel had been killed, where the divine punishment had fallen, and where the accursed ruins now stood as a warning to all who passed. The consequence for centuries was avoidance. Local traditions treated Mada'in Saleh as a haunted place, a cursed landscape, a site whose stones one should not disturb and whose ground one should cross quickly if one had to cross it at all. Travellers reported that Bedouin guides were reluctant to camp near the tombs. Muslim pilgrims on the road to Mecca were sometimes advised, if their route brought them past the site, not to drink from its wells and not to linger in its shadow. The Prophet Muhammad himself, in a tradition that circulated widely, was said to have discouraged his followers from entering the ruins except in a spirit of sober reflection on the fate of those who reject divine warning. And this religious avoidance, whatever else it did, had a curious and finely productive effect. It preserved the site. Where other ancient cities of the region were quarried for building stone, dismantled for their metal fittings, cleared for agriculture, or simply overrun by later settlement, Mada'in Saleh was left alone. Its tombs stood untouched. Its inscriptions weathered but did not disappear. Its rock-cut facades kept their carved eagles and their sphinxes and their stepped merlins, kept the fine chisel marks of the Nabatean stonemasons, kept the dedications and the ownership documents that had been inscribed above their doorways 2,000 years ago. The place that the living refused to occupy became, by that very refusal, the place where the ancient record survived. When, from 2001 onward, systematic archaeological survey and, in 2008, the first joint Franco-Saudi excavation campaign began under the direction of Laila Neymeh of the French CNRS and her Saudi colleagues, what they found at Hegra was not a site denuded by centuries of reuse, but a site preserved by centuries of avoidance. 131 monumental rock-cut tombs, ornamented with the elaborate facades that are the signature of Nabatean funerary architecture. Inscriptions above the entrances that, unlike the largely uninscribed tombs of Petra, functioned as legal documents, recording the name of the tomb's owner, the family members entitled to be buried within it, the prohibitions against unauthorized use, the penalties for violation, and, crucially for the archaeologist, the date of the tomb's construction expressed in the regnal year of the reigning Nabatean king. Based on these dated inscriptions, Hegra's monumental necropolis could be located with unusual precision in time. The tombs flourished between the last decades before the Common Era and roughly the year 74 of the Common Era, a window of less than a century during which the Nabatean kingdom, at the height of its wealth, invested extraordinary resources in the funerary monuments of its southern capital. This is a corpus without parallel in the ancient Near East, the single richest concentration of dated funerary epigraphy from the pre-Islamic centuries. And it exists at Hegra and not at Petra, precisely because Petra was reused and re-inhabited across the intervening centuries while Hegra was left to its ghosts. In 2008, UNESCO inscribed Mada'in Saleh as Saudi Arabia's first World Heritage Site. It was the beginning of a slow and careful process of opening the site to the world, of allowing the archaeologists and the epigraphers to read what the stones had been waiting to tell. But the double-layered strangeness of the place, a site avoided as a curse that has become the world's richest surviving archive of Nabatean funerary inscription, a Quranic landscape of divine judgment that has yielded to modern science one of the most articulate ancient records the peninsula possesses, remains its defining quality. The living refused it, and by refusing it, they gave it to us. What the inscriptions say, and what the Thamud themselves were, and how the Nabatean genius for water made agriculture possible in a country that seems to forbid it, are questions that Hegra is only now beginning, in the patient hands of its excavators, to answer. Read the inscriptions themselves, and the abstraction of dates and dynasties resolves into voices. The tomb known today as Qasr al-Bint, the Palace of the Daughter, a name given by later Arabic-speaking travellers who could no longer read the ancient script and reach for a legend to fill the silence, carries above its doorway one of the most precisely dated funerary inscriptions in all of ancient Arabia. It records that the tomb was carved by a sculptor named Hor, son of Ahi. It was made for a man called Hani, son of Tafsi, and for his family, and it was completed in the 40th year of the reign of King Aretas IV, sovereign of the Nabateans, which places its execution in the neighbourhood of the year 31 of the Common Era, within a generation of the crucifixion in Roman Judea, and within the lifetime of men and women whose grandchildren would witness the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Hor the sculptor, Hani the patriarch, Tafsi his father, Aretas the king, 4 Arabic-speaking human beings, named and datable, stepping forward out of the sandstone into the historical record with the same casual particularity as any Roman senator or Greek merchant of their century. And they are not alone. Along the tomb facades of Hegra, in the elegant Aramaic-derived cursive that scholars call Nabatean script, other names crowd in with them. There are inscriptions naming women as tomb owners, women who commissioned their own monuments and specified in the carved text which of their heirs might be buried alongside them. There are inscriptions naming professional titles, the strategos, the priest, the merchant, the cavalryman, that map onto the administrative vocabulary of a functioning Hellenistic-influenced kingdom. There are inscriptions that curse anyone who alters the tomb or displaces the buried. There are inscriptions that lay out inheritance in careful legal formulae, the ownership descending from father to daughter to grandson through generations, that must have stood exactly where the modern visitor stands, reading the same lines and understanding still what they meant. The bureaucratic mind of the Nabatean kingdom is preserved above these doorways with a candour and precision that Petra, for all its grandeur, cannot match. And the reason is simple. At Petra, tomb inscriptions were rare and mostly did not survive. At Hegra, the desert climate and the centuries of avoidance conspired to keep them legible. What was lost in the more famous capital was saved in the shunned southern city. Yet if the visitor lifts his gaze from the imposing carved facades and looks instead at the raw sandstone of the surrounding cliffs, at the outcrops that ring the site, at the boulders that lie fallen along its wadies, at the sheltered surfaces beneath overhangs where a traveller might have paused in the shade, a different, older and stranger record begins to appear. Scratched into the rock in cruder letters, unpolished, sometimes barely more than a few marks in a stick-figure camel or ibex, are inscriptions in a script that predates the Nabatean tombs by centuries. Some 50 of these earlier texts have been catalogued at Hegra itself, alongside cave drawings and rock engravings whose vocabulary and letter forms belong to a completely different tradition. 19th century European travellers, encountering such inscriptions across the northwestern Arabian peninsula, coined for them the collective label Thamudic, borrowing the ethnonym from the Quran and the pre-Islamic poets. The label has proved sticky and, as modern epigraphers have come to understand, deeply misleading. But the phenomenon it points to is real. Under and around the Nabatean necropolis, on the same stones and sometimes overlapping with the later Aramaic script, an older Arabian population has left its signature. These Thamudic inscriptions span an enormous range in time. The earliest examples in the region date from perhaps the 6th century before the Common Era. The latest continue into the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, well after the Nabatean kingdom itself had been dissolved. And they range across an equally enormous geography, from the Hejaz in the west to the Najd in the interior, from the borders of ancient Edom in the north to the frontiers of Yemen in the south. Wherever the caravan tracks passed through, wherever a shepherd might have rested his flock, wherever a traveller might have sheltered from the noon sun, someone with a sharp implement and time on his hands scratched a name, a lineage, a prayer, a grievance, sometimes a boast, sometimes only a mark of having been there. The sheer volume of the material is staggering. Tens of thousands of individual inscriptions have been catalogued across northwestern and central Arabia. Many tens of thousands more, epigraphers estimate, remain unread on the rocks where they were carved. The scholar who has done more than any other to bring this vast corpus into the light is Christian Julian Robin, the French Orientalist and long-serving Director of Research at the French National Centre for Scientific Research. Robin, working with a network of Arabian, European and American colleagues, has spent decades in the field and in the archives, photographing, transcribing, cross-referencing and analysing Thamudic and related pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions. His conclusions, developed alongside those of the British scholar Robert Hoyland and others, have overturned the assumption implicit in the 19th century label. The Thamud, as they emerge from this modern epigraphic work, were not a single people. Thamudic, as it emerges, is not a single language. What earlier scholars had lumped together under one ethnic name is, on closer examination, a family of related scripts and a set of related dialects, used across many centuries by many different tribal groupings, scattered across the northwestern half of the peninsula. The label is a scholarly convenience that has hardened into a phantom nation. But, and this is the point on which the whole meaning of the Quranic record rests, the phantom is not empty. Beneath the misleading label, there is a genuine historical population. The Quran names the Thamud, alongside the Ad, as one of the ancient peoples whom God destroyed for their arrogance and their rejection of the prophet sent to them, a people associated in the sacred text with the carving of houses in the mountains and with a specific act of impiety involving a she-camel. That description, a people who carve their dwellings from living rock, who inhabit the northwestern deserts, who flourish and then vanish, fits, with uncanny precision, what the epigraphers now know about the population that preceded the Nabateans at Hegra and across the Hejaz. Hoyland's interpretation, developed with characteristic caution, is that the name Thamud was originally born by a specific tribal confederation and was later adopted, or borrowed, or generalized by successor groups inhabiting the same territory. The linguistic and epigraphic continuity is real. The ethnic identity is fluid, which means that the Quranic Thamud may be preserving, in the compressed and moralizing form appropriate to sacred literature, a genuine historical memory of a real predecessor culture, a memory that the Arabs of the 7th century inherited from their own oral traditions, and that modern archaeology, working from the opposite direction, is now beginning to confirm. The implications for the wider argument are enormous. If Thamud is not a fable but the folk memory of an epigraphically attested population, then the other Quranic ethnonyms, the Ad of the Towering Columns, the people of Al-Ras, the Companions of the Thicket, the Madian whom the prophet Shu'aib was sent to warn, deserve to be reconsidered not as theological ciphers but as compressed archaeological data. The Quran on this reading is not inventing peoples. It is inheriting them from the same reservoir of pre-Islamic Arabian memory that gave the pre-Islamic poets their vocabulary of vanished tribes. The theological framework, the warning, the prophet, the destruction, the divine judgment, is the interpretive shell within which the historical kernel is preserved. And modern epigraphy, working stone by stone across the cliffs of the Hejaz, is beginning to crack that shell. What did these vanished predecessors write about? Read the Thamudic inscriptions in bulk, as Robin's team has done, and a picture emerges of a mobile, tribal, largely pastoral society, deeply preoccupied with genealogy, with pasturage, with the movements of livestock, and the alliances and quarrels between clans. Many inscriptions are simply names, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, of the clan of such and such, carved into a rock face for reasons we can only guess at. Others record dedications to pre-Islamic deities, whose names appear again in the poetry of the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance that preceded the Prophet. Others record grievances, prayers for rain, prayers for the recovery of a lost animal, prayers for a safe return from a raid. It is a corpus without kings and without palaces, without monumental architecture, without the administrative apparatus of a state. It is the writing of a society that lived in tents and travelled with its flocks and marked its passage on the rocks it passed. And it existed in the same landscapes, and often on the very same stones, that the Nabatean stonemasons would later polish smooth for the funerary inscriptions of Areta's the fourth subjects. Two Arabias, layered upon one another, an older, dispersed tribal Arabia of the pastoralists, and a newer urban monarchical Arabia of the caravan kingdoms. The Nabateans did not arrive in an empty land. They arrived in a land already thick with names, and they wrote their own names on top. To the modern archaeologist standing among these overlapping scripts, one question presses forward more insistently than any other. How did the Nabateans, arriving in this arid country, transform a landscape that supported only pastoralism into a landscape that supported cities of tens of thousands? What did they know, and what did they build that their Thamudic predecessors did not? The answer, when it comes, is not military and not administrative, and not even, in the deepest sense, architectural. The answer is water. Consider the country. Hegra sits on a plain in the northern Hejaz where the modern annual rainfall is measured in a handful of millimetres, most of it falling in brief and unpredictable winter storms that vanish into the sand almost before they touch it. There are no permanent rivers. There are no perennial streams. There is not even, in the immediate vicinity, a spring of the sort that in other arid regions might permit a small oasis settlement to grow around it. The water table exists. During the Nabatean period, hydrological studies indicate it sat approximately 10 metres below the surface, but it is not a resource that presents itself. It has to be reached, and reached in quantity, and distributed, and stored, and kept free of contamination, and defended against evaporation in a climate where the summer temperatures routinely exceed 45 degrees Celsius. The problem is not simply of finding water. The problem is of building an entire hydrological civilization from the ground down. And this is what the Nabateans did. Leila Neme's team, working at Hegra across successive campaigns, has identified more than 130 ancient wells in the western and northwestern quadrants of the site, precisely where the underlying geology brings the aquifer within reach. These wells range from 4 to 7 metres in diameter. Enormous shafts, in some cases more like sunken rooms than the narrow pipes of a modern well, and they descend through the sandstone to depths of around 20 metres below the surface, cutting straight through the rock where the geology permits and lined with fitted sandstone masonry, where the surrounding soil is too loose to hold a shaft on its own. The construction is not casual. Each well represents a substantial investment of labour and a substantial investment of engineering understanding. Someone knew where to dig. Someone knew how deep to go. Someone knew how to keep the shaft from collapsing. Someone knew how to lift the water out, by animal-powered pulleys, by counterweighted sweeps, by long ropes and leather buckets, and how to distribute it, once lifted, into the channels and cisterns and irrigation systems that turned the wellheads into a functioning agricultural infrastructure. Because the wells did not merely supply drinking water, they supplied a garden district. The excavated evidence from Hegra shows that the land immediately surrounding the settlement was placed under irrigated cultivation. Date palms grew in the shaded groves that the wells made possible. Cereals ripened where without human intervention nothing would have grown but scattered acacia. Legumes filled the soil with nitrogen and human diet with protein. Fruit trees produced their unlikely harvests in a country whose native vegetation is measured in centimetres of ground cover per square metre. And, most remarkably of all, cotton, a plant whose water requirements are among the highest of any cultivated crop, a plant one associates with the flooded fields of the Indus or the irrigated bottomlands of Egypt, was grown at Mada'in Saleh under Nabatean management. Cotton in the northern Hejaz, in a country that receives less rain in a year than a European garden receives in a week, The audacity of the enterprise is difficult, from our comfortable distance, to fully register. And what was done at Hegra was done in a different geological register at Petra. There, the Nabatean water engineers faced a different problem, not the deep aquifer of the Hejaz, but the sudden and violent flash floods of the Wadi Musa, and the challenge of bringing water from springs several kilometres east of the city centre, down through the narrow gorge of the Sikh to the urban core. The solution was an integrated network of aqueducts, ceramic pipelines, rock-cut channels, silt-trap dams, and covered cisterns, running for kilometres along the cliff faces and beneath the paved surfaces of the city. Along the Wadi Mataha, a section of ceramic pipeline was constructed on an elevated platform along the dry riverbed, its terracotta segments fitted together with such precision that the flow could be maintained across long distances with minimal loss. The pipes themselves were manufactured in modular sections, standardised so that damaged elements could be replaced. The channels were sloped so precisely that hydraulic engineers today, applying modern surveying instruments to the ancient works, have concluded that the Nabatean surveyors were operating within tolerances that would not be routinely matched again in the region for 1,000 years. And these channels did not simply deliver water, they controlled it, slowed it, silted out its sediment, distributed it into holding cisterns cut into the living rock, and released it on demand into the fountains and pools and gardens and baths of a city whose entire elegance depended on the illusion that water was abundant in a country that had almost none. Estimates of Petra's population at its first-century peak vary. The archaeological consensus places it in the tens of thousands, though the precise figure remains disputed by the specialists. But whatever the true number, it was a scale of habitation that the natural landscape could not, without human engineering, have supported for a season. The Nabatean water system supported it for centuries, and it did so with a quiet, invisible, almost domestic reliability that is the highest achievement of any hydraulic civilization. In the great cities of the ancient world, water is usually the visible signature of imperial power. The aqueducts of Rome, the qanats of Persia, the tanks of Sri Lanka, the stepped wells of India. In Nabatea, the water system is discreet. It runs beneath the pavement. It emerges only at the point of use. It leaves the traveller with the impression that these cities of the desert are somehow watered by grace. And this modest architectural presence is what allowed the system, after the kingdom's fall, to be almost entirely forgotten. Because it did fall. In the year 106 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Trajan sent his legate Cornelius Palmer to annex the Nabatean kingdom. The annexation appears to have been substantially bloodless. The last Nabatean king, Rabel II, may already have been dead. His successor did not resist. The caravan cities and their agricultural hinterlands passed into the new Roman province of Arabia with a smoothness that suggests exhaustion rather than defeat. And within 2 centuries, well within the span of a single family's memory, by the standards of the ancient world, the entire Nabatean civilization had ceased to exist as a coherent political and cultural entity. Petra shrank. Hegra was largely abandoned. The caravan routes shifted. The water systems, without the central authority that had maintained them, silted and cracked and eventually failed. The gardens returned to sand. The wells, though many continued to be used by later Bedouin, ceased to feed the intricate irrigation networks that had made the cotton grow. Within 4 centuries, the memory of what had been done here was so thoroughly lost that when Muslim armies passed through the Hejaz in the 7th century, they found the great tombs of Hegra standing empty and unexplained, and could only understand them through the Quranic lens of a divinely destroyed people. Why did such an elaborate civilization vanish so completely? The specialists offer partial answers. The shifting of trade to maritime routes through the Red Sea, the environmental strain of centuries of intensive cultivation, the political reorientation of the region around Roman and later Byzantine and Sasanian centres of gravity, but no single explanation fully accounts for the totality of the disappearance. A kingdom that had mastered the desert lost its mastery, and when the mastery was gone, the desert took back what had briefly been withheld from it. To grasp the true scale of the world that was lost, one has to widen the frame beyond the Nabatean north and look southward, down the long spine of the Arabian Peninsula, along the route that had brought the frankincense from the Dofa cliffs to the Mediterranean ports for 1,000 years before the first Nabatean caravanserai was ever built. The incense road, as the Romans came to call it, ran for roughly 2,500 Roman miles, some 3,500 kilometers in modern reckoning, from the port of Shabwa in the interior of South Arabia to the terminal at Gaza on the Mediterranean coast. Its southern spur reached farther still, down to the frankincense harbour of Mosca Liman on the Omani coast, where the resins collected from the boswellia trees of the Dhofar Mountains were loaded onto coastal vessels for the voyage to Qana on the Yemeni shore, and from there dispatched inland to Shabwa and the great caravan cities of the Yemeni highlands. Along the road's inland course, it threaded through the successive kingdoms of Hadramaut and Saba, past the oasis of Najran, up along the Hejaz through Mecca and Medina, and finally north to Petra and Hegra and the Mediterranean coast. Every stage of the journey was taxed. Every stage was serviced by wells and caravanserais and merchant colonies and armed escorts. Every stage generated wealth, and that wealth built cities, and those cities in turn built the temples and the palaces and the irrigation works that made further wealth possible. The Nabatean north was only the last and the most northerly link in a chain that stretched for centuries and for thousands of kilometers across a peninsula that the outside world imagined as empty. At the southern end of that chain, in what is today the war-torn Republic of Yemen, lay some of the greatest and least known cities of the ancient world. Between roughly the 8th century before the Common Era and the 6th century of the Common Era, a succession of South Arabian kingdoms rose, flourished, contended with one another, and eventually consolidated into a single realm. The earliest and most famous was Saba, the Sheba of the Hebrew Bible, whose queen, in the biblical narrative, travelled north to Jerusalem to test the wisdom of King Solomon. Saba reached the height of its power between the 8th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, when the ruler Karibil Watar extended Sabaean authority north to Najran, southwest to the Gulf of Aden, and east along the coast to the Hadramaut Plateau. Alongside Saba stood its rivals and neighbours, Ma'in, whose Manayan traders established colonies as far afield as the Egyptian delta and the Aegean island of Delos, Qataban, whose caravan-controlling capital held one of the strategic passes of the incense route, Hadramaut, whose harbour at Qana and inland capital at Shabwa oversaw the collection and taxation of the frankincense trade, and the older, more mysterious kingdom of Ausan, which appears in the Sabaean inscriptions as a rival, and is later heard of no more. 6 main states dominated the south. All of them wrote in the elegant geometric monumental script that scholars call ancient South Arabian, a script whose letters, standing rigid and beautiful on the stone stelae of Yemeni temples, are as clearly and confidently the mark of a literate civilization as any Roman inscription of the same era. And of all these southern capitals, the greatest was Marib. It stood on the eastern edge of the Yemeni highlands, at the point where the seasonal torrents of the Wadi Dana emerge from the mountains and would, without human intervention, have dispersed uselessly into the sands of the Ramlat Sabbatain. It was not a natural oasis, it was an engineered one. Its life depended on the greatest hydraulic monument of the pre-modern Arabian Peninsula, the Marib Dam, an earthwork of such scale and such longevity that the South Arabian inscriptions themselves refer, again and again across the centuries, to the successive campaigns of repair required to maintain it. Alongside Marib, along the caravan routes, and in the fertile pockets of the highlands, other cities kept their own vigils. Barakish, the walled Manayan stronghold known in the ancient texts as Yathil; Shabwa, the Hadrami capital captured in the 3rd century of the Common Era by the Sabaean king Sha'iru Mautar, whose military inscriptions record the campaign in triumphant detail. Through the work of the French archaeological mission to Yemen, and through the decades-long labours of scholars such as Remy Audouin and his successors, these sites have begun, in fragments and against the terrible headwinds of modern political catastrophe, to enter the historical record, and what they collectively reveal is a landscape of monumental architecture, of temples, of palaces, of city walls, of irrigation works, that ranks, in ambition and in execution, with the great archaeological zones of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and that remains, of all such zones, perhaps the least known to the outside world. By the middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era, this long southern story reached its culmination and its constriction. Under the ruler Shama Yuharish, around the year 270, the Himyarite kingdom of the southern highlands absorbed in turn Saba, Qataban, and Hadramaut, unifying the whole of South Arabia under a single crown for the first time in its recorded history. The old plurality of kingdoms gave way to a single Himyarite realm that would endure for another 3 centuries before its own dissolution, amid the wars of Christian Ethiopia, Zoroastrian Persia, and ultimately the rise of Islam. The incense that had built these cities continued to flow northward, and the caravans that carried it continued for a time to enrich the Hejaz. What had fallen at Ubar, and what would eventually fall at Hegra and at Petra, was not an isolated collapse. It was one node in a system 3,000 years old, stretching from the frankincense groves of Dhofar to the wharves of Gaza, and populated at every stage by kingdoms whose names, Serba, Ma'in, Kataban, Hadramaut, Ausan, Himyar, Nabatea, the world outside the Arabic-speaking peninsula would, for the most part, forget. To understand any one of these vanished cities is to begin to see the outline of the whole, and to see the whole is to recognise that the ancient Arabia recovered by satellite and by trowel is not a curiosity at the edge of the classical world. It is one of the great lost civilizations, and it has been sitting all along in plain view. At the heart of that whole system, sustaining it as surely as a heart sustains a body, stood a wall of stone and packed earth thrown across a mountain valley in the Yemeni highlands. It is difficult at first to believe the scale of the thing simply by looking at the surviving fragments. 2 great stone sluice complexes remain, one at the northern flank of the wadi, one at the southern, massive angular structures of dressed masonry that even now, half buried by drifting sand and shattered by centuries of neglect, retain the unmistakable proportions of monumental engineering. Between them once ran an embankment of astonishing length, an earth and stone bulwark that captured the seasonal torrents of the Wadi Dana as they rushed down from the mountains after the monsoon rains and turned that fugitive water, which would otherwise have been swallowed within days by the parched sands beyond, into the lifeblood of a city. This was the Sad Marib, the great dam of Marib, and it was by any measure that ancient engineering can be measured, one of the wonders of its world. The construction, in its earliest recognisable form, is dated to the 8th century before the Common Era, in the high period of the Sabaean kingdom, when the rulers of the south had begun to understand that the frankincense wealth flowing north through their territory could be leveraged into something more permanent than a caravan tax. They chose to build a garden. Not a garden in the modest sense of the word, a bed of herbs, a walled courtyard, but a garden in the imperial sense that the ancient Near East reserved for its greatest works, an artificial oasis engineered on a scale that could feed a metropolis. The impounded waters of the dam, released through the sluices in carefully regulated flows, were channeled outward across the plain into a network of primary canals, secondary distributaries, and field-level ditches that watered, at the height of the system's operation, some 9,600 hectares of cultivated land. 96 square kilometres of desert turned green, wheat, barley, dates, vines, alfalfa for the caravan camels, a whole agricultural economy conjured by human ingenuity from a valley that, without the dam, would have grown nothing but the low thorny scrub of the Ramlat Sabbatain. And upon that engineered fertility rose a city whose population, at its peak, may have approached 50,000 souls, a figure that, in the ancient world, marks Marib as a great capital by any standard, comparable in scale to the greater cities of Hellenistic Syria or Ptolemaic Egypt, and vastly larger than anything else the Arabian interior would sustain for another 2,000 years. Ancient writers, when they heard of it, reached for hyperbole. Later Arab tradition remembered Marib as a place of walled gardens and paved streets, of palaces perfumed with the resins of its own trade, of a court whose queen, the Queen of Saba, the Queen of Sheba, had once travelled north to the court of Solomon bearing gifts of gold and spice. Some modern chroniclers have called it, with perhaps forgivable enthusiasm, the Paris of the ancient world. The comparison is not to be taken literally, but it does capture something essential, that Marib was, in its context and its era, not a frontier outpost or a caravan halt, but a genuine centre of civilization, a place where a king's inscription in the elegant monumental script of the south could be commissioned by literate scribes, carved by skilled masons, erected in a temple built by trained architects, and read by a population that measured its wealth in the millions of gold pieces annually generated by its monopoly on frankincense and myrrh. The dam itself was not a single act of construction, but a continuous act of maintenance. This is one of the most striking features of the Marib record. The Sabaean and later Himyarite inscriptions, laboriously deciphered by generations of epigraphers, refer again and again to campaigns of repair, to breaches sealed, to sluices reinforced, to workforces mobilized under royal command to save the structure from the annual violence of the floodwaters it existed to tame. The dam, in a sense, was never finished. It was rebuilt continuously across more than 1,000 years, generation upon generation of Yemeni engineers inheriting and augmenting the work of their predecessors in a chain of transmitted knowledge that has few parallels anywhere in the pre-modern world. Two great repair episodes stand out in the surviving epigraphic record, one in the year 450 of the Common Era, one in the year 543, each commemorated in long dedicatory inscriptions that record the names of the kings responsible, the numbers of labourers mobilised, the quantities of provisions consumed, and the technical particulars of the works undertaken. Reading those inscriptions today, one has the strange sensation of holding, in one's hands, the maintenance logs of an ancient bureaucracy that understood its infrastructure with the same precision that a modern civil engineer understands a hydroelectric installation. And then, somewhere between the years 570 and 575 of the Common Era, the dam finally broke and did not rise again. The exact mechanism of the final failure is debated. Some scholars have pointed to an unusually violent monsoon season, overwhelming a structure whose maintenance had begun to falter as the Himyarite state contracted under external pressure. Others have argued for a tectonic event, an earthquake whose shockwaves undid what a millennium of patient masonry had built. What is not debated is the outcome. The impounded waters escaped in a single catastrophic release. The canals that had carried the controlled flow across the plain now channeled instead a devastating flood, and the cultivated hectares that had fed the city were, within a few seasons, reclaimed by the desert. The population dispersed. The old accounts speak of tens of thousands of people abandoning the ruined oasis and moving northward, into the Hejaz, into the interior of the peninsula, into the fringes of the Levantine world, carrying with them the memory of a lost paradise and the trauma of an irrevocable collapse. The extraordinary thing, the thing that makes Marib not merely another ancient ruin, but a document of unusual historiographical power, is that this collapse occurred within living memory of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet was born, by traditional reckoning, in the very year of the final failure, or within a handful of years of it. The migrant lineages that carried the story of the flood into the tribes of the Hejaz would have been the grandparents and great-grandparents of the generation into which he was born. And when the Quran, in Surah Saba, Surah 34, named after the very kingdom whose capital had been Marib, speaks of the Sail al-Arim, the flood of Arim, and describes how the two gardens of the Sabaeans, one on the right hand and one on the left, were replaced by gardens of bitter fruit and thorn. It is not reaching into the mythic deep time of distant antediluvian legend. It is speaking of an event whose ruins were, at the moment of the revelation, still smoking, still fresh in the memory of the Arabian communities to whom the words were first addressed. This is the historiographical revelation that patient German excavation, carried out under conditions of increasing difficulty across the 1980s by Werner Kuss and the teams from the Heidelberg Academy, has quietly delivered to the world. The Marib campaigns worked with the Sabaean inscriptions in one hand and the surviving masonry in the other, correlating the epigraphic record of repairs with the physical stratigraphy of the sluice structures and the deposits of the ancient reservoir. They reconstructed, from these two independent lines of evidence, a chronology of dam operation and dam collapse that resolved into a specific historical timestamp, the second half of the 6th century of the Common Era, terminating in the catastrophic failure of the 75s. The Quranic reference, in other words, is not the echo of a myth. It is the theological interpretation of a historical event that a modern archaeologist can walk to, measure, photograph, and date. One can stand today at the northern sluice complex of the Marib Dam, place a hand upon the dressed masonry that Sabaean and Himyarite workers set into place across 1,000 years, and be touching the same stones that Arabian tradition remembers as the site of a divine judgment. There are very few places in the world where scripture and stratigraphy meet with such precision. To grasp what this means, one must adjust one's sense of what the Quran is doing when it names the peoples it names. The condemned cities, Ad, Thamud, Iram, Madian, the people of Saba, are not, in the text, presented as figures from a lost mythic age comparable to the giants of Genesis or the titans of Hesiod. They are presented as historical warnings, as places whose fate is legible in the ruined landscape of the peninsula itself, and what the 20th and 21st centuries of archaeological work in Arabia have progressively demonstrated is that the text was correct in this claim, in a much more literal sense than modern readers, working within the assumptions of a demythologized scholarship, had been prepared to accept. Saba was a real kingdom. Marib was its real capital. The dam that fed the city really existed, really failed, and really failed in the 6th century of the Common Era. The people who dispersed from its ruined fields really carried their story into the Hejaz. What theology framed as judgment, archaeology has framed as engineering, hydrology, and stratigraphy. But the underlying event is the same event. Two vocabularies converge upon a single ruin. If one steps back now from the specific case of Marib and from the specific cases of Ubar, Petra, Hegra, Dilmun, and the southern kingdoms that have occupied this account so far, one begins to see that all of these sites are only the visible peaks of a much larger submerged inventory. And here the story shifts registers, from the world of trowel and stratigraphy to the world of orbital sensors and machine-processed imagery. Because for all that traditional excavation has achieved across the past century in Arabia, the true revolution in the mapping of this lost civilization has not come from the ground. It has come from above. The technique itself has a founder, and her name is Sarah Parcak, a professor of anthropology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and the director of the Laboratory for Global Observation. Parcak began her career applying multispectral satellite imagery to the archaeology of Egypt, developing methods that could detect from orbit the subtle variations in topography, soil chemistry, and vegetation cover that betray the presence of buried architecture. A mud brick wall long since collapsed and covered by sand still, decades or centuries later, alters the moisture retention of the soil above it. That altered moisture, in turn, alters the reflectance of the surface at wavelengths invisible to the naked eye, but perfectly legible to the sensors mounted on satellites in low Earth orbit. Buried mud brick, in effect, casts a shadow that only a satellite can see. Parcak refined the technique across the Egyptian delta and along the fringes of the former Roman Empire and demonstrated again and again that the density of undiscovered archaeological sites, even in the most intensively studied regions of the ancient Mediterranean world, was orders of magnitude higher than the traditional survey record had suggested. What Parcak's method proved in Egypt, subsequent applications have proved across the whole of the Near East and, crucially, across the Arabian Peninsula. The Aerial Archaeology in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia project, known by its acronym AXU, and its sister project AXAC, was tasked in early 2018 with a systematic aerial and remote sensing survey of the Al-Ula hinterland and parts of Khaybar in the northwestern Hejaz, conducted by teams from the University of Western Australia. Working with helicopter-mounted cameras, LIDAR-equipped drones, and satellite imagery cross-referenced against ground survey and targeted excavation, the AXAU and AXAC campaigns have, over the years since, documented in excess of 20,000 archaeological sites, ranging in date from the Paleolithic to the recent past, across a landscape that had, until then, been almost entirely blank on the archaeological map. 20,000 sites, in a single hinterland of a single region of a single peninsula. The number is difficult to absorb. It suggests, on the most cautious reading, that everything hitherto known about the antiquity of northern Arabia is a footnote to a body of evidence that has been sitting on the ground, in plain view, for millennia, and that has only now begun to be seen because the eye that sees it flies at an altitude of several hundred kilometres. Among the most spectacular of the discoveries produced by this new mode of survey are the structures known as mustatilat, from the Arabic word for a rectangle. These are monumental stone enclosures, low-walled and open-ended, laid out in elongated rectangular plans across the volcanic and sandstone landscapes of the northwestern peninsula. Some are modest, a few tens of meters in length. Others are vast, extending across the desert floor for distances measured in the hundreds of meters, the longest examples reaching, by some reports, close to 600 meters from head to tail. Their walls are seldom higher than the knee. Their function was manifestly not defensive. Their internal architecture centers on a raised head-end platform, often incorporating stone chambers whose excavation, undertaken by the AXAO team, under the direction of the archaeologists Hugh Thomas and Melissa Kennedy of the University of Western Australia, has yielded ritual deposits of animal bone. The mustatilat are, on present evidence, ceremonial. They are the traces of a ritual practice that ordered the Neolithic Arabian landscape on a scale and with a degree of architectural investment that no one working from ground level alone had suspected could exist there. And the dates that have been proposed for these structures push the story of Arabian monumentality deep into a horizon that predates almost everything else in the region. The mustatilat, on current interpretations, are among the oldest ritual monuments so far identified in the peninsula, older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, older than the megaliths of northwestern Europe, older by more than 1,000 years than the earlier circles of Stonehenge. They were built by populations whose descendants would, in due time, dig the wells and lay the caravan tracks of the frankincense age. Populations who, we now realise, were already ordering the desert with architecture at a moment when most of the world's later great civilizations had not yet begun to inscribe themselves into the earth. What was Arabia doing in that deep Neolithic that required monuments of this scale? Who were the people who quarried the stones, who dragged them into their rectangular plans, who returned to their head-end chambers to leave the bones of their offerings? The mustatilat, in the strictest sense, are silent. They do not carry inscriptions. They do not speak. But their presence, in the thousands, across a landscape long dismissed as marginal and unproductive, refuses to remain silent. It insists. It reopens the question of what Arabia was, and for how long it has been what it was, at every horizon deeper than the one the frankincense trade illuminated. The implication is stark. What this documentary has so far described, the fortress at Shissa, the tombs at Hegra, the palaces of Petra, the mounds of Dilmun, the temples and dam of Marib, is only the surviving above-ground record of the most recent chapters of a much longer story. The real inventory of lost Arabian civilization is not to be measured in hundreds of sites or in dozens of cities. It is to be measured in tens of thousands of stone enclosures, in the buried footprints of settlements that satellite imagery has not yet fully catalogued, in the innumerable knots of a landscape whose deep human history has been, until this moment, almost entirely invisible to the outside world. Every additional square kilometre of survey, every new pass of a multispectral sensor over the peninsula's untouched interior adds to the count. The map is being redrawn in real time, and this brings the account back by a widening spiral to the question with which it began, to the Ad, to Iram of the Pillars, to the Quranic geography of Al-Ahqaf. Because if the record of pre-Islamic Arabian civilization is much larger than had been assumed, if, that is, the peninsula was populated at every horizon by more people and more polities than the traditional survey had recognised, then the identification of Iram with a single caravanserai at Shissa, satisfying as it was in the first flush of the 1992 discovery, may have been prematurely confident. It may have been correct as far as it went, but it may not have gone far enough. The Quranic text is explicit about the geography of the Ad. They are said to have dwelt in Al-Ahqaf, the curved sand dunes, a place name that classical Arabic commentators, from the earliest generations of exegetical writing onward, have almost universally located in the southern part of the peninsula, in the region of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. The medieval biographer Ibn Ishaq, whose Life of the Prophet became one of the foundational documents of Islamic historiography, states plainly that the territory of the Ad extended from Oman to Yemen, and that they belonged, in origin, to Al-Ahqaf, from which they spread into the adjoining lands. Al-Ahqaf, on this reading, is not a small place. It is the enormous curved sand sea that fills the southern third of the peninsula, 650,000 square kilometres of dune fields, one of the largest continuous sand deserts on the surface of the earth. To locate the Ad within Al-Ahqaf is to distribute them across a territory the size of a small subcontinent. The single caravanserai at Shissa, sitting at the desert's northern edge, is a plausible node within that territory. It is not, on the plain reading of the classical geography, plausible as the whole of it. And the recent work of the Saudi Heritage Commission, published in a series of survey reports across the years 2021 and 2022, and undertaken in collaboration with French archaeological partners, has begun to fill in the fuller picture. In the Najran region, at the northern threshold of the empty quarter, a province that itself accounts for something on the order of a quarter of the desert's total area within the Saudi kingdom, teams have documented a cluster of large pre-Islamic settlement sites of Bronze Age and later occupation. around Wadi al-Dawasa, along the modern road that connects the wadi with Najran, and in the intervening zone at the desert's edge, ground survey and ground-penetrating radar have identified settlements whose remains extend in some cases back into the Neolithic. The Al-Faw archaeological zone, south of Riyadh at the empty quarter's northern margin, has yielded evidence of a complex urban centre whose full scale is only beginning to be understood. Discoveries have been reported some 100 kilometres south of Wadi al-Dawasa, along that same corridor, in a landscape that satellite reconnaissance had earlier flagged as anomalous. What emerges from this accumulating record is not the outline of a single lost city, dramatic and singular in the manner of the earlier reporting on Shissa, but the outline of a settlement complex, a distributed pattern of pre-Islamic occupation stretched along the arc where the empty quarter meets the inhabited zones of the southern peninsula. If the Ad were a people, and if Iram was their homeland, then the archaeological expression of that homeland is not to be sought in one dot on the map. It is to be sought in the whole arc. Iram, on this reading, was less a metropolis than a cultural geographic designation, the memory, preserved in Arabic tradition and in Quranic scripture, of a network of Bronze Age and Iron Age communities that once populated the northern margins of the great southern desert, that traded and fought and prospered across many centuries, and that eventually declined amid the shifting climates and shifting trade routes of the late pre-Islamic era. What Nicholas Clapp found at Shissa was one true node of that network. What subsequent survey has begun to reveal is that the network was far larger than the node, and that the search for Iram, so triumphantly declared concluded in the winter of 1992, was never in fact concluded. It had merely begun to open at its proper scale. To stand at the edge of the empty quarter today, at the point where the last thorn scrub gives way to the first true dunes, is to feel the strangeness of this recognition. The desert stretches ahead in a silence that seems, at first encounter, absolute. A silence measured in hundreds of thousands of square kilometres of unbroken sand. And yet the sand is not empty. Beneath it, at intervals whose density orbital survey is only beginning to establish, lie the buried footprints of a civilization that inhabited this landscape when the pyramids were being planned, that traded across it when Solomon sat on his throne in Jerusalem, that fought its wars across it in the age of Rome, and that vanished from the world's record so completely that its very existence became, for a time, a matter of legend. The satellites now looking down upon that silence are hearing what the ground refused to say, and what they are hearing is that the story is bigger, older, and stranger than anyone had permitted themselves to imagine. And yet the same technology that is now revealing this buried continent is arriving at a moment when what remains above the sand, and what still stands in the cities and citadels of the Arabian world, is being erased at a pace no scholar can match. The race that Nicholas Clapp began at Shiyah, and that the satellite programs have since scaled to the whole peninsula, is not merely a race against the slowness of orbital sensors and the patience of ground survey. It is a race, quite literally, against demolition, against bombs, against the bulldozer, the mortar shell, the guided munition, the crane. The paradox of the present moment in Arabian archaeology is that just as the tools have finally arrived to see this world in its true breadth, the world itself is being cleared away, sometimes in the name of piety, sometimes in the name of profit, sometimes in the name of war, and sometimes in a confluence of all three that is difficult to disentangle even for those living inside it. Consider first the twin cities of Islam. Mecca and Medina are, by any reckoning, among the most historically layered places on earth. For nearly 14 centuries they have been continuously inhabited, continuously venerated, continuously built upon. The Ottomans, at the height of their empire, invested lavishly in their protection and adornment. The Mamluks before them raised walls and gates, madrasas and shrines. And before both, the pre-Islamic geography of the Hejaz, the same geography that produced the Nabateans, the Thamud, the caravan routes that fed Mecca's rise as a trading centre, left its own stratified deposits beneath the streets of the two holy cities. To dig anywhere in Mecca or Medina is, in principle, to encounter a section drawing of the entire Arabian past, and yet, since the early 1920s, the direction of policy in the Hejaz has been steadily toward erasure rather than preservation. On the 21st of April in the year 1925, the mausoleums and domes at al-Baqi in Medina were levelled. Al-Baqi is the cemetery in which, by Islamic tradition, many members of the Prophet Muhammad's own family are buried. The visible markers indicating those resting places, the domes, the enclosures, the inscriptions accumulated across centuries, were reduced in a matter of days to flat ground. The doctrinal reasoning invoked at the time turned on a rejection of what was deemed idolatrous veneration of graves. The practical consequence, however, was the removal of an entire layer of Islamic material culture, and with it the physical bridge that had once connected the modern city to the earliest Muslim generations. That first campaign of demolition has, in the decades since, been steadily accelerated by campaigns of a different character. In 2002, the Ajad fortress in Mecca, an Ottoman citadel raised in the year 1780, was demolished. In its place rose the Abraj al-Bayt Tower, one of the tallest buildings ever constructed, and the centerpiece of a hotel and retail complex overlooking the Grand Mosque. In 2011, Saudi Arabia formally launched a $20 billion expansion plan for Mecca and Medina, an initiative whose stated aim was the accommodation of ever larger numbers of pilgrims and whose practical effect has been the systematic dismantling of what remains of the Ottoman and Mamluk fabric of both cities. The Hilton Hotel now occupies the ground where once stood the house of Muhammad's father-in-law. Preservationists working from photographic archives, planning permissions and the memories of long-resident families have estimated that as many as 95% of the historic sites around Mecca and Medina have been razed within the span of a single lifetime. The response of the international heritage community has been muted, and where it has spoken, its speech has been carefully qualified. Turkey, whose Ottoman ancestors built much of what has been lost, protested formally and sought backing from UNESCO. UNESCO, in reply, indicated that the matter was, in a phrase that has become notorious among historians of the region, a Saudi question. Saudi Arabia has never submitted Mecca for inscription on the World Heritage List. The absence is instructive. To submit a site is to accept international obligations for its preservation, and to accept those obligations is to accept a form of external supervision. In the two cities that stand at the centre of Islamic devotion, no such supervision has ever been accepted. The demolitions proceed under sovereign authority, and there is, in any practical sense, no body empowered to say them nay. The consequences for pre-Islamic archaeology are indirect but real. Every layer removed from above is a layer of context lost from below. Every foundation trench excavated for a hotel tower or a parking structure is an opportunity for salvage archaeology that, in almost every case, does not take place, or takes place only in the most compressed and unsystematic fashion. The pre-Islamic Hejaz, the world of the Thamud and the Lianites, and the Nabatean traders who once passed through what is now central Mecca, lies somewhere beneath the reinforced concrete of the modern city, and its recovery, if it is ever to occur, will require a change in disposition that shows no sign of arriving. Southward, in Yemen, the pattern of loss takes on a different and more brutal aspect. Here the erasure is not the byproduct of urban development, but the direct consequence of aerial warfare. Since the outbreak of the current conflict, coalition airstrikes on one side and Houthi ground operations on the other have transformed a country whose archaeological record is among the richest in the Arabian Peninsula into a landscape of continuous emergency. The figures compiled by antiquities officials working under conditions of extreme difficulty tell the essential story. Of some 2,318 documented archaeological sites in Yemen, approximately 477 have been destroyed or seriously damaged during the war. More than one site in 5, in other words, has been visibly and materially harmed within a span of years, so short that the field's normal mechanisms of documentation cannot keep pace with the losses. The specific incidents, when catalogued, describe a slow-motion catastrophe. In August of 2014, Houthi forces seized the ancient city of Barakish, one of the great fortified centres of the Mada'in Kingdom, whose walls and Temple of Nakra are dated to the 4th century before the Common Era. Barakish had already been the focus of Italian archaeological work for decades. It was a site whose stratigraphy carried the history of the Mada'in trading state, one of the constellation of South Arabian kingdoms whose caravans had fed the frankincense road for 1,000 years and more. The Houthis fortified it as a military position. In March and April of 2016, coalition airstrikes struck the fortified city again, and by the time the dust settled, an estimated 70% of the Temple of Nakra, a building whose walls had stood for 2.5 millennia, had been destroyed. Before withdrawing from the site in April of that same year, The departing forces planted landmines on its outskirts, ensuring that even the recovery work would be quite literally a mortal risk. At Marib, the great dam whose collapse in the 6th century had already once bent the trajectory of Arabian history, was struck a second time in the modern era. In May of 2015, the northern gate of the dam, a structure very close to 3,000 years old, whose sluices and revetments had been documented and studied by the German archaeological mission across several decades, was hit by coalition ordnance as Houthi forces took up positions in its immediate vicinity. The strike was, in the technical language of aerial warfare, precisely aimed. Its target was a military position. Its effect, incidentally, was to damage a monument whose survival had already required the coordinated labour of 100 generations of Sabaean and Himyarite engineers, and whose reappearance in the archaeological record had required a further century of scholarly work. Shibam, whose mud brick towers had earned it the name of the Manhattan of the desert, has also been damaged. Sana'a, whose old city holds one of the most extraordinary concentrations of pre-modern, domestic architecture in the world, has been repeatedly struck. And the museum collections, the storerooms, the excavation depots that ordinarily house the movable finds from decades of Yemeni fieldwork have, in many locations, been abandoned, looted, or hidden away in the private homes of curators and archaeologists who understood when the shelling began that no institutional guarantee would preserve what they had spent their working lives assembling. The story of Yemeni archaeology in the years of the war is, in significant measure, the story of individuals concealing pieces of the national heritage behind their own domestic walls, in the hope that the walls will hold. Beyond Arabia proper, in the adjacent Levantine and Mesopotamian theatres, the same pattern of deliberate and incidental destruction has played out at an even more spectacular scale. Palmyra, the caravan city of the Syrian desert, whose Aramaic-speaking merchant elite maintained trade connections that reached deep into the Arabian world, and whose architectural vocabulary shared much with the Nabatean South, was seized in 2015 by militants of the so-called Islamic State. The demolitions that followed, of the Temple of Bel, of the Temple of Balshamin, of the Monumental Arch, of the Tower Tombs, of the theatre's scenic wall, were carried out with explosives and cameras in an almost ceremonial idiom. The destruction was filmed, it was distributed, it was intended quite explicitly as a message. The message was that the pre-Islamic past, and any Islamic past deemed insufficiently orthodox, existed only to be destroyed. The looting that accompanied the demolitions of Palmyra and of countless less famous sites across Syria and Iraq fed a market whose reach extended into private collections across 3 continents. For the Arabian archaeologist watching all of this from within the region, the effect is a peculiar compound of urgency and helplessness. The tools have never been better. The satellite imagery is more precise, the ground-penetrating radar more sensitive, the multispectral sensors more capable of distinguishing buried structure from surrounding matrix than at any previous point in the discipline's history. And yet the objects to which those tools are meant to be applied are, at multiple points around the region, being converted into rubble faster than the surveys can be completed. The film's central premise, that this civilization is only now being confirmed, is shadowed at every turn by the recognition that some of the evidence for that confirmation will not survive to be examined. The race is not merely against time, it is against ordnance, against the crane, against the bulldozer, against the certainty of certain regimes that whatever their citizens will require in the future can only be accommodated by the removal of what those citizens have inherited from the past. What secrets, one is compelled to ask, are being ground into dust at this very moment? What inscriptions, what foundations, what stratified deposits are passing beyond retrieval as this sentence is being spoken? And yet, in the midst of this shadow, there stands a recognition of a very different kind. A recognition that has been slowly forming in the paleographic literature of the last several decades, and that carries within it a strange and consoling irony. The peoples whose cities the Quran memorializes as destroyed have not, in fact, been erased as completely as either their enemies or their mourners have imagined. They have survived, in a form so intimate and so pervasive that its very presence has escaped notice for centuries. They have survived in the letters of the Arabic alphabet itself. The demonstration of this proposition is the life work of a small international community of scholars specializing in the paleography of pre-Islamic Arabian scripts, and it has been given its most systematic exposition in the volumes of Beatrice Grundler, whose study of the development of the Arabic scripts from the Nabatean era to the first Islamic century has become the standard reference for anyone attempting to trace the ancestry of the letters in which the Quran was first recorded. Gruendler's argument, sustained across hundreds of pages of comparative analysis of inscriptions, coins, ostraca and papyri, is that the essential features of the Arabic script, the shapes of its letters, the logic of its ligatures, the principles by which it joins one character to the next, can be traced back, in nearly every case, to Nabatean models. The Arabic alphabet is, in its bones, a Nabatean variation of the Aramaic alphabet. To follow the demonstration is to watch the transition unfold across a small handful of inscriptions, whose importance is out of all proportion to their number. The Namara inscription, dated to the year 328 of the Common Era, and now on display in the Louvre, records the epitaph of an Arab king in language and script that stand at the very hinge of the change. The linguists who have examined it describe its language as an early form of Arabic. The paleographers who have examined it describe its script as a late version of Nabatean, in the very act of becoming something else. The two descriptions are not in conflict. They are the same observation from two angles. What Namara records is a moment in which a Nabatean scribe, writing after his kingdom's political dissolution by 2 centuries, adapted the letters he had inherited to a language whose sounds his ancestors' script had not been designed to capture, and in doing so laid down the template from which everything that followed would grow. Behind Namara, the trail runs backward into the working documents of the Nabatean administrative world, into the everyday, non-monumental hand of the merchants and scribes who conducted the commerce of Petra and Hegra. That everyday hand was faster, more cursive, more flexible than the formal script of the great tomb facades. It was open to change in a way that ceremonial inscriptions could not be, and in the centuries following the Roman annexation of the Nabatean kingdom in the year 106 of the Common Era, the annexation that ended the political existence of the state, that flexible everyday script did not disappear. It spread. Freed from the standardizing pressure of a central royal chancery, it dispersed across the Arab scribal communities of the northern Hejaz and southern Syria, where its practitioners continued to adapt it, letter by letter and generation by generation, to the language they spoke among themselves. Ahead of Namara, the trail continues into the inscriptions of the 5th and 6th centuries, into the Zabad inscription of 512, into the Jabal Ram inscription, into the trilingual text at Harran, into the small corpus of pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions in which the shapes of the letters can be seen crystallizing, still visibly Nabatean in ancestry, into the forms that would be recognizable as Arabic to any reader of the Quran. By the time the first Muslim community at Medina was writing down the revelation on parchment and palm frond and bone, the letters they used were the great-great-grandchildren of the letters that had been carved into the tomb of Qasr al-Bint by Hur, son of Ahi, in the 40th year of the reign of King Aretas IV. The physical continuity is unbroken. Every stroke of every Arabic letter is a Nabatean stroke, modified by generations of scribes but never severed from its origin. The implication of this finding is difficult to overstate. The Quran, in its earliest written form, was recorded in a script whose immediate ancestors were the very people its verses name among the destroyed. The Talmud, whose inscriptions and tombs at Hegra fill the Quranic memory of divine judgment upon a lost civilization, wrote in scripts that stand in the same broad family. The Nabateans, whose tomb facades and inscriptions and administrative documents provide the paleographic bedrock of the transition, were the people through whose hands the writing tradition passed on its way to Muhammad's Mecca. The text that memorializes their destruction is, in the most literal graphic sense, written in their handwriting. There is, in this, a peculiar kind of survival. A survival that no bulldozer can undo, no explosive can reach, no doctrinal purge can extinguish, because it inhabits not the stones of the destroyed cities, but the shapes of the letters in which the destruction is described. The destroyed have left their mark, not in the monumental architecture of their kingdoms, most of which is either buried, plundered, or bombed, but in the alphabet through which every subsequent generation of Arabic speakers has read of their fate. To read the Quran in Arabic is, whether one knows it or not, to hold in one's eye the direct visual descendant of the Nabatean hand. Every alif, every bar, every meme, every ya bears within its curve the pressure of a Nabatean scribe's stylus, transmitted forward across the collapse of a kingdom and the rise of a religion. What could be more strange than this? What could more perfectly capture the paradoxical relation between a civilization and the memory that survives it? And yet the destruction to which that surviving alphabet bears witness was not, in the 6th century of the Common Era, an ancient matter. It was not distant history refracted through the memory of poets. It was, in the decades immediately preceding the composition of the Quran, a live catastrophe. The world whose loss the Quranic verses describe was not a world separated from the audience of those verses by millennia. It was a world separated from them by years, in some cases by months, in some cases still smoking as the words that mourned it were being spoken. The final decades of the pre-Islamic Arabian order are the true climax of this long story, because they are the decades in which everything the preceding chapters have laboured to reconstruct. The caravan trade, the client kingdoms, the irrigated capitals, the temple economies, the maritime networks, came apart in a single generation, and they are the decades in which, in a caravan trading town at the edge of the collapse, a merchant named Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born. The trigger, as the archaeological evidence and the surviving textual record now allow us to reconstruct it, was the final failure of the Marib Dam. The great structure had already survived, and been repaired after catastrophic breaches in the middle of the 5th century and again in the year 542. Each repair had required the mobilization of resources whose scale is recorded in inscriptions still legible on the dam's revetment stones. But by the second half of the 6th century, the political capacity of the Himyarite kingdom to sustain those mobilizations was faltering. Scholars still debate the immediate mechanism of the final collapse. Some emphasize seismic activity in the region during the period. Others point to exceptional rainfall events whose runoff exceeded the dam's already weakened capacity. The debate is unlikely to be resolved definitively. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Around the year 570 of the Common Era, the dam gave way, and the irrigation of the roughly 100 square kilometres of cultivated land around Marib, the agricultural base that had sustained the largest city in southern Arabia for 1,000 years, came to an end. The demographic consequence was immediate. Estimates preserved in the later Arabic tradition, and broadly consistent with what the site itself can be made to yield, suggest that as many as 50,000 people migrated out of the Marib region in the wake of the collapse, dispersing northward and westward into the Hijaz and beyond into the Levant. Whole tribal formations whose subsequent history would be traced in the genealogies of the early Islamic period are said to have originated in this dispersal. The event lodged itself in the memory of Arabic-speaking peoples with a specificity that few earlier disruptions had achieved. It was named. It was mourned. It was, when the Quran came to be composed, referred to in Surah 34 as the flood of the dam, the Sail al-Arim, an event so nearby in time that its immediate victims were still alive to be remembered. The people who walked away from the Marib Dam carried almost nothing that archaeology could recover. The ceramic vessels they had set on their tables, the inscribed stelae that commemorated their kings and consecrated their gods, the mud brick walls within which 300 generations had slept, quarrelled, prayed, and bargained. All of that remained behind, some of it to be excavated 14 centuries later by German teams working in the Yemen highlands, much of it still sealed beneath the silt that the irrigation channels had deposited over 1,000 years of use. What the refugees carried was lighter than stone, and more durable than bronze. They carried words. This is not a metaphor. The oral tradition of pre-Islamic Arabia was, by the 6th century of the Common Era, one of the most sophisticated mnemonic systems the ancient world had produced, refined across generations of desert life, in which writing was rare, portable, and fragile, and in which the trained human memory was the only archive a community could reliably carry with it across the terrain. A poet in the centuries before Islam did not perform for entertainment alone, though entertainment was part of it. A poet was the tribe's historian, its genealogist, its diplomat, and its surveyor. The poem encoded the lay of the land, the quality of the wells, the reliability of the seasonal rains, the genealogies that established alliance and obligation, and the sacred geography that oriented the community in a landscape too large and too hostile to navigate by anything so fragile as a written map. When the dam gave way and the tribes dispersed northward and westward into the Hijaz, they dispersed carrying this archive inside them, not as sentiment, not as nostalgia, but as operational knowledge, as the accumulated geographic and cultural intelligence of a civilization whose physical infrastructure had just been taken from them. The greatest of these surviving records is a collection known as the Mu'allaqat, the suspended odes, or, as the tradition preserved it in the centuries after, the hanging poems. 7 long qasidas, composed by 7 poets of the 6th century, poets whose names Arabic literary culture has never ceased to honour: Imru al-Kayz, Tarafa ibn al-Abd, Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, Labid ibn Rabi'a, Amr ibn Kulthum, Antara ibn Shaddad, Al-Harith ibn Hiliza. A legend that crystallized in the 10th century CE holds that these poems were inscribed in golden letters on linen scrolls and hung upon the walls of the Kaaba at Mecca, suspended in the sacred precinct as offerings, the highest distinction the tradition could bestow upon a human composition. The legend may be exactly that, an idealization, a later glorification of works whose canonical status was secured after the fact by the literary culture of the Abbasid courts. But the structure of the legend is itself significant. To the literary imagination of medieval Islam, the proper place for the supreme achievement of pre-Islamic verse was the Kaaba, the same site around which the cities and caravans and trade networks described in these poems had once revolved, the same sacred threshold toward which the frankincense roads from Dofa and the silver routes from the Yemeni highlands had been directed for 3,000 years. The legend remembers, even if it mythologizes, the organic connection between the poetry and the civilization from which it grew. What makes the Mu'allaqat so extraordinary, and what makes the scholarship of the past several decades so important for any attempt to understand the world this film has reconstructed, is the form in which these poems are cast. The classical Arabic qasida opens always with a movement known as the nasib, a passage in which the poet stands before the traces of an abandoned campsite, contemplating the marks left by the tent pegs, the fire rings, the trampled ground, the fragments of blackened wood where a hearth once burned, and meditates on the passage of time and the departure of those who were once present. The beloved's caravan has already moved on. The dwelling is empty. The land holds only the impression of a life that is no longer there. This is the form's obligatory opening, its most recognizable feature, and it is, when one has spent time among the sites this film has visited, the collapsed towers at Shissa, the rock-cut tombs at Hegra, the silt-buried margins of the Marib Dam, almost impossible to read without a sensation of precise archaeological recognition. Because the nasib is not merely a conventional elegiac gesture, borrowed by one poet from another as a formal courtesy. It is a description. The poet names the place, names its features, names the quality of the wind across the exposed ground, names the species of plants that have reclaimed the disturbed soil, names the direction of the route by which the departed have gone. Scholars who have spent their careers reading these poems against the landscape of the northern and southern Hejaz, the Najd Plateau, the margins of the empty quarter, have noted repeatedly that the geographic information encoded in the nasib is not decorative. It is accurate. It describes specific places that can, in certain cases, still be identified on the ground and on the map. It records the seasonality of rainfall at specific locations, the presence or absence of water sources along specific roads, the social geography of tribal territories whose physical traces are now being mapped by satellite survey. The poem was, in the most literal available sense, a geographic record made by a people who possessed no other technology capable of preserving geographic information reliably across generations. The scholar Susanna Stetkevich, whose work on the pre-Islamic qasida remains among the most penetrating analyses of the form in any language, has argued that the abandoned campsite opening is not simply a convention passed from one poet to the next, but a structural necessity, the form's way of accomplishing the essential cultural work of encoding place into memory. The nasib in her reading is a technology of preservation. The poet mourns the departure of the beloved in order to fix the coordinates of departure indelibly in the listener's mind, the name of the wadi, the colour of the sandstone, the direction of the prevailing wind, the season of the rains, the species of trees in the valley below. The emotion is the mnemonic device. Grief, being more reliable than a map, more resistant to alteration than a clay tablet, was used to accomplish what neither clay nor papyrus could. And then the qasida moves into its second great section, the rahil, the journey, the traversal of the desert, in which the poet describes the harshness of the terrain, the endurance of the camel, the quality of the